Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku's new roommate was Bakugou? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Why is your number always at 0? Izuku turned his head to look at the young girl who was suddenly looming over his desk, her brows furrowed in confusion. Izuku followed her line of sight and glanced down at the numbers on his forearm, the dark ink stark and clean against his skin like that of a tattoo. It read, very clearly, midnight, just as it always had. Before Izuku could launch into an explanation, someone else butted into the conversation, a classmate with blonde, spiky hair, and eyes like fire with a temperament to match. Katsuki Bakugou was Izuku's friend. Sort of. He had been his friend for a long time, but it seemed that recently the other didn't want anything to do with him. Izuku still didn't really understand why. "It's 'cause Deku doesn't have a soul mate," the other burst out, grinning. "He's a freak." Startled, Izuku turned to the other boy and immediately tried to defend himself. "Kaken. That's not true. I just dash." Izuku looked back at the girl, whose eyes had softened with what was both pity and fear. He hated the pity more than anything. He swallowed thickly, voice caught in his throat. "I just. Come in, Deku, get real. Everyone knows what counters are for. They count down to when you're gonna meet your soulmate, and yours has always been at 0. Bakugou laughed, baring his teeth in a mock grin. Izuku brought his gaze down to his desk, turning his palm flat against the surface so that his forearm followed, the numbers disappearing from sight. His ex-friend wasn't wrong. His counter had always been at 0, from the moment it appeared on his skin. Bakugou had been around him long enough to be well aware of this fact. "It doesn't mean I don't have a soulmate, Kaken. It just means it might just mean something happened to them. Or maybe that I passed them before the soul mark appeared, you know? There's a lot of reasons people don't have soulmates." Izuku tried to explain, pulling from all of the knowledge he had from his cumulative months spent researching the way soul marks worked. He'd made good use of his library card in the past, obsessively looking into every case of timed-out soul marks that he could find. Bakugou snorted. "Yeah, keep telling yourself that, nerd. I can see why you don't have a soulmate. You're so annoying. Who'd want to be with you, anyways? Even if you did have a soulmate, I bet they'd leave you. I'd rather die than have a soulmate like you." Izuku didn't look up, refused to meet Bakugou's eyes. He never liked what he saw in them anymore. He didn't reply. Sorry I brought it up, Izuku," their classmate spoke up suddenly, twisting her hands together in a way that showed her obvious discomfort. She left quickly, clearly feeling unwelcome in the new atmosphere. She probably agreed with Bakugou, most people did, that he was weird for having a broken timer. Only old people were supposed to have timed-out soul marks, since they'd already met their soulmate usually. For a kid to just be born with a bunch of zeros? It wasn't natural. He'd heard other adults call him unfortunate when talking to his mom, and other kids whispering that it was weird. "Kaken, why did you do that?" There was a brief pause before Izuku felt the palm of Bakugou's hand on the back of his head, fingers tangling in his unruly hair, and then it shoved his face down against his desk, hard enough that when he managed to sit up straight in his chair again, he felt blood dripping down his nose to his lips, copper on his tongue. He used the back of his hand to wipe some of it away, tears stinging at his eyes and threatening to spill out at any moment. "Because everyone should know you're a freak, Deku, that's why. Don't you think there's a reason you were born without a soulmate?" Right, Izuku agreed, his throat feeling dry. He watched Bakugou stroll out of the classroom, seemingly undisturbed by the entire exchange. Taking a deep breath to steady his emotions and stave off any stray tears, Izuku gathered his belongings and packed them into his bag. He found an old package of tissues and used it to clean his face as best he could, tossing the wad of bloody ones away as he started on his way back home. Bakugou was supposed to be his friend, but it had been a very long time since he'd acted like it. It had started once they were in classes together. As soon as everyone around them gained enough self-awareness to start showing off their soul marks, giggling and chattering, Bakugou had lost all interest in their friendship. It had continued all the way through middle school, relentlessly. Izuku never got to find out why, and that bothered him more than the bullying sometimes. Not understanding Kaken was something new to him. Sure, the blonde had always been crass and rude, but his better qualities always shone through above all else. He was smart, reckless, athletic, and competitive to boot. It seemed that anything he did, he excelled at. So, despite his behavioral problems, he had always been doted on by those around him, including Izuku. The ending of their friendship had been abrupt, leaving no room for talking or working things out. Bakugou had been perfectly clear that he hated Izuku, and at the same time he managed to get most of the school on his side when it came to picking on him. It was a blessing when he and his mom finally moved away after his last year of middle school. It was a chance to start over, to focus fully on his studies, and to finally hide his soul mark behind long sleeves or bandages and tie off a piece of himself to keep it a secret, at least for a while. Izuku smiled wearily at his mom, who had just burst into tears for the 4th time today. She was wiping at her eyes with the long sleeve of her cardigan, her cheeks and nose slightly pink as she sniffled a little. "Mom, please, you have to stop crying." "I know," she fretted, her voice a little shaky as she wiped her eyes more furiously. "I just can't help it. My baby boy is going away to college. I'm just so proud of you, Izuku." Izuku was sure she would have pulled him into another hug if he wasn't holding 2 cardboard boxes in his arms at the moment. Izuku looked around at the others bustling around the dorm's parking lot, cars honking and flashing hazards everywhere. They'd been lucky enough to grab a parking spot, but they had barely gotten 5 feet from the car before his mom had started the waterworks again, and now they were standing in the middle of various kinds of traffic, not moving, while she tried to hold herself together. At home it had been endearing, but right now it was a little embarrassing. He loved his mom, but she'd cried twice this morning at home and once while driving them to campus. Izuku knew it was a big step for her, to accept him moving out and into the dorms to attend the most prestigious university in Japan, so he tried to be considerate and not rush her too much. His arms were starting to hurt from holding the boxes up, though. "Okay, sorry. Izuku's mom found a napkin in her purse and dried her eyes, taking a deep breath. "Sorry dear, let's get going." She picked the duffel bag up again and Izuku hurriedly began leading the way towards Tower C, where his new dorm would be. The elevators were terribly crowded, people pushing bins and roller suitcases and boxes and blankets in before climbing in afterwards. It took 20 minutes for Izuku to get to his floor, 12 stories up, arms straining the entire time. He dreaded knowing it was definitely going to take a few more trips, and he was suddenly grateful that he hadn't packed all of his collectible superhero memorabilia. "It's room 1217, Izuku said to his mom as they shoved past some people to get off the elevator and started down the hall. They found a little map by the elevator doors and used it to find where Izuku's room would be. The halls themselves were plain and it seemed that most decorations hadn't been put up yet. A nearby bulletin board sat empty with colorful paper prepped as though it would soon be decorated, a box of what looked to be crafting materials sitting on the floor below. On the door to his room, there was another, smaller bulletin board with little cutout stars placed all around it. There were 2 giant stars where, presumably, the names of the occupants were supposed to be written, but clearly they either hadn't gotten to their floor yet or their particular RA was a slacker. Izuku wasn't going to pass judgment yet, but it did mean that he had no idea who his roommate was going to be. Not even a name at this point. He put the boxes down by the door and fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a folded white envelope containing the brass key to the room. He unlocked the door with ease. The room itself was also plain, sterile, and inoffensive in its simple decor. Tower C was newer, built recently for honors students, so the floor was light-colored faux wood, matching the desk, bed frame, and built-in closet. The walls were painted a mellow off-white, the window curtains drawn and allowed a lot of natural light in. Nothing seemed badly damaged or dirted since these rooms had yet to be forced to endure endless years of college-aged stupidity. Izuku had been expecting a terrible, dimly lit cinder block cell with particle board furniture, so he and his mother were both pleasantly surprised by the modern, comfortable space. One half of the room was already half moved into, though, Izuku noted. The bed on the right side was already made up with red flannel sheets and a black comforter, a half-empty suitcase sitting top with some clothes still in it, folded neatly. On the desk were a couple of boxes, one filled with what looked to be posters and various knickknacks. On the floor next to the bed were various bags and boxes, things clearly still packed away in them. It seemed that his roommate had already started setting themselves up. Izuku didn't mind that he'd chosen a side already and put his own boxes down on his desk, wanting to inspect the room further. Wow. My dorm was never this nice, Izuku's mom marveled, propping the duffel bag up on Izuku's bed, plastic mattress cover crinkling under the new weight. I'd expect nothing less for my little scholarship student. Her face was aglow with pride, eyes shiny with more tears. She pulled Izuku into a hug before he could protest, telling him how proud she was for the nth time. Izuku laughed and thanked her again, hugging her tight to his chest. She was quiet when she pulled away, her hands holding tight to Izuku's arms, her expression fond and loving. I can't believe how tall you've gotten. Mom, you see me every day, he laughed, and they headed out the door and back to the hall, knowing they needed to make a few more trips yet. I know, honey, but it always amazes me how quickly you grew up. You'll get it when you're a parent. She laughed, and they found their way back to the crowded elevator. It took 4 trips total to get all of Izuku's stuff out of the car and into the dorm room. The whole time, there was no sign of his roommate, either in the halls or in the dorm itself. Considering it was early afternoon, Izuku figured he'd gone to lunch with his family or something. To be honest, he was nervous about meeting him. He'd heard so many horror stories about roommates gone wrong. What if they played loud music at midnight or slept with the lights on? What if they never cleaned the microwave? Cleaned the microwave too much? Never showered? Had people over all the time and locked him out? Got a sudden urge to learn how to play the saxophone mid-semester? There were too many variables to consider, so Izuku tried not to. He'd already had several anxiety spirals over this issue, and he figured there wasn't anything he could really do about it, anyways. He'd just have to wait and see what his future held. Before he could even start unpacking, Izuku's mom dragged him outside and demanded she treat him to a nice, late lunch. Knowing it might be his last decent meal for a while before he filled his life with cheap microwave meals and cafeteria food of a yet-to-be-determined quality, he gladly indulged her. They ate and toasted his new adult life. His mom may have cried again. And, as a final parting gift, she foisted a bag full of leftovers she had made on him, so that he wouldn't have to miss her home cooking for the week. They hugged again in the parking lot and quietly, by himself, Izuku made the elevator ride back to his dorm. He was quickly becoming accustomed to the route. Without his mom, he felt a bit of a lonely pit in his stomach. He was excited, sure, but it was his first time really being on his own as well. It was as intimidating as it was exhilarating. When Izuku found his room again, he could hear music behind the door, loud, lots of screaming and guitars. His heart sunk a little, but he tried not to pass judgment too quickly. The guy was alone right now, after all. He'd probably use headphones once he met his new roommate, right? Izuku took a deep breath and twisted the doorknob, pushing it open as casually as he could to hide his nerves. He thought about the greeting he'd rehearsed in the mirror earlier today. Hey, I didn't see you here earlier. It's nice to meet you. Izuku froze in the doorway, the other man in the room mirroring him. He was holding up a sweater, clearly in the middle of putting it on a hanger when Izuku had barged in. Izuku had been preparing for a lot of possibilities behind the door, but this was not on his list. Blonde, spiky hair, and eyes like fire with a temperament to match. Katsuki Bakugou, undoubtedly. The two of them stared at each other silently for a moment, the loud electric guitar blasting from the small speaker on Bakugou's desk suddenly deafening. There was no mistaking that it was his old childhood friend. His jawline had gotten sharper, any boyish features gone now. On top of that, he'd gotten taller and more built as well. He'd always had an athletic build as a kid, but with age he'd filled it out with muscle, clearly focused on his upper body strength. It wasn't immediately obvious that Bakugou recognized him back. He seemed to furrow his brows deeply before his pupils contracted and his eyes went wide. It wasn't a hard expression to read. Izuku had gotten adept at reading him so many years ago. He was very clearly more surprised than he was angry, despite how he bared his teeth in a grimace. Izuku was the first to speak up as the song in the background broke into a harsh drum solo. Keita kaken? No sheet, Deku? The F are you doing here? Izuku didn't know how to answer that without making it sound like Bakugou had asked a stupid question. He frowned and looked away for a moment, thinking, I mean that this is my room. 12-17-inch. Quickly, Izuku backed up a couple of steps and looked up at the outside of the doorframe. The numbers were clear, bright white against the dark metal plaque. Yeah. He definitely had the right room, as if he'd really had any serious doubts about that in the first place. No, you idiot, I meant what the F are you doing here? At UE? Bakugou rolled his eyes, finally breaking from his shocked stupor so he could finish the task of putting his sweater on a hanger. He laid it neatly on a stack of other clothes he had also been neatly prepping for the closet. Izuku, despite his nerves, actually managed to smile at that. Well, to be fair, I did always tell you I'd be able to get in too. He laughed and shut the door behind him, finally. Once Bakugou had started moving again, some of the tension in the room had diffused. You're not the only one who apparently worked hard during high school, you know. At that, Bakugou's fists clenched around the dress shirt in his hands, wrinkling the dark red fabric. F off, like I don't know that. I just didn't think they'd lower their standards for someone like you. He practically spat, his motions harsh as he draped the shirt over the hanger and began angrily buttoning it up. Years ago, this kind of talk would have hurt Izuku more than he could say. But he'd gone to a new high school after his miserable years in middle school dealing with Bakugou's constant teasing. He'd made new friends with the same goals as him, even if he wasn't the most popular there either. He'd proven himself to be in the top % of his class, academically speaking. He'd made peace with the fact that his soul mark was timed out, and even found people around him who were the same. He'd absolutely earned the position he stood in currently. He'd earned being able to stand in his dorm, at his school, despite anyone trying to drag him down. It had been 4 years since he'd seen Bakugou Katsuki, and like hell he was going to let him think nothing had changed or that he could still affect him in the same way. Playground bully or not, they were not on the playground any longer. Izuku calmly put the food his mom had given him in their shared mini-fridge. Then he walked over to Bakugou's desk and shut his music off, heart pounding in his chest at the way Bakugou whipped his head around to glare at him and yell. Okay, so maybe Bakugou still affected his nerves a little bit. Still, he wasn't going to let it show. They didn't lower their standards for me, Kaken. I got into this school just the same as you. I worked hard, and I'm going to keep working hard. We're roommates, okay? That's an unavoidable fact, so we're going to have to at least try and get along. Bakugou's nose crinkled. I know that. Doesn't mean I have to be happy about being stuck with you, Deku. What, you think that just because you ran away to some other high school and got into UE2 you get to boss me around now? Huh. I'm not trying to boss you around, Kaken. I just don't want to start this semester on the wrong foot. 2 DMN late for that. And I just think things will be better if we talked. Bakugou turned to look at him as though he'd grown another head. He looked confused before he went back to putting clothes on hangers, now at a messy and furious pace. Nothing to talk about, nerd. Stay on your side of the room and I'll stay on mine. And don't if they touch my stuff ever again, you got it? Izuku let out a heavy sigh, but put his hands up in defeat. It was like talking to a brick wall. Okay, Kaken, whatever you say. As soon as Izuku went back to his side of the room and began unpacking his own things, Bakugou smashed the play button on his speaker and twisted the volume knob as loud as it could go. Sure, Izuku had heard all sorts of horror stories about bad roommates, but he was certain none of them had to deal with the one and only Katsuki Bakugou. The first few days were rough. He'd been close to Bakugou as a child, sure, but living with him was an entirely different beast. His standards of cleanliness turned out to be beyond anything your typical college student should possess, to the point of being insufferable. Izuku had found this out when he'd come home from his first day of classes and immediately had a broom shoved into his arms, before he'd even gotten the chance to put his backpack down or take his shoes off. Clean up your mess. Clutching the broom and dustpan in his hands, he didn't reply, only giving Bakugou a blank stare. He had no idea what mess he was even talking about, considering they'd been in the room for a total of 3 days at this point. The blonde practically growled and pointed at the floor under Izuku's desk. Izuku tilted his head and looked, but couldn't see much. He walked over to inspect further, finally seeing the small gathering of crumbs under his chair. You were eating granola last night and it got FING everywhere. Everywhere? What are you talking about? It's just a little dash. Do you want mice in our dorm? Begrudgingly, Izuku had swept up the crumbs and emptied the dustpan into their shared trash can. It wasn't as though he had a good rebuttal for not cleaning up, anyways. If it diffused Bakugou, it was worth the minor strain. Beyond that, Bakugou was not unconventional. He didn't adhere to any of the usual college stereotypes, it seemed. He kept himself on a strict schedule. He woke up willingly at 6 a.m. to go running and go to the gym before his classes. Izuku worked out too, but even he did so more sporadically and at more normal hours of the day, when he could squeeze it in between his classes. Because of his workout schedule, Bakugou went to bed by 9 p.m. almost every single night, often shutting the lights off without asking and putting in his earplugs to pretend he couldn't hear Izuku's protests. He was keen on forcing Izuku to deal with and adapt to his schedule. It was Bakugou's way or bust, it seemed. Izuku didn't particularly want conflict, so he often found himself working in the dark or moving to the lounge if he wanted to stay up. It all struck Izuku as fundamentally petty. Bakugou had moved. Away from schoolyard taunts, sure, but it wasn't entirely clear if this was any better or any more mature. Izuku was eternally grateful that a few of his friends from his high school had ended up going to UE as well, otherwise he might have found the situation outright miserable. On a Friday night after their first week of classes, he was glad to be going out to dinner rather than going back to his dorm to get chewed out for the next thing he'd done wrong. His friend Ida was the first one to spot him and flag him down when he entered the little ramen shop. It was good and cheap, so naturally it was also crowded and small. They'd managed to push 2 tables together and barely fit at it all together, but they didn't really mind pressing close. Midoriya, Ida called, smiling before he made everyone scoot down so that they could fit their final puzzle piece in. Hey guys, Izuku said, slinging his backpack off his shoulders and putting it under his chair to try and save space in the tiny establishment. They all greeted him back, looking happy and hungry. I know it's only been a week, but it feels like forever since I've seen you all. Uraraka grinned up at him, all bright smiles and flushed cheeks. She had been the first friend Izuku had made back when he'd moved schools, a kind girl with a soft spot for him and by extension, the most investment in his current situation with his past tormentor. It didn't surprise Izuku when it was the first thing she asked about. How's the roomie situation? Still as bad as your last group chat update? Izuku laughed softly and settled in at the table. I'd rather not talk about it right now. It can't be that bad, can it? Sue spoke up next, her voice low and nasally, easily distinguishable from anyone else. She was generally quiet, hunched over in her chair and tilting her head at Izuku questioningly. Her long hair was pulled into an elaborate updo resembling a bow, given the unseasonably warm weather outside. It's fine, guys. I'm just adjusting is all. It's weird since we haven't seen each other in so long dash. He treated you like shit. I still think you should submit a room request change. Uraraka pouted slightly. She'd been vehemently against Izuku trying to just deal with the situation on his own in the first place. Izuku rubbed the back of his neck, smiling nervously. I know. I just think that's a bit rash. Besides, the honors dorms are so nice. Right, Todoroki? Who knows where they'd place me if I asked to move out? One of the others glanced at him as his name was mentioned, then nodded slightly. He has a point. The building is practically brand new. It'd be hard to give that up. Todoroki had actually ended up on floor 5 of Tower C. Izuku hadn't known at all until he'd ran into him in the student lounge one night. He was their friend, but he was tight-lipped about a lot of things and had trouble keeping up with their online group chat. It got so bad that when they actually needed to get him to reply to things, they changed the name of the entire group to Red and White Alert. Todoroki read this, or some variation thereof, so that he'd know they needed his attention. Failing that, the plan was relentless phone calls. He was soft-spoken in a lot of ways, but Izuku really liked having him around, and he knew the feeling was mutual even if he wasn't the best at expressing it. He and Todoroki had actually started off on terrible terms back in his junior year of high school. Todoroki had been the first person his age that he'd ever met in real life who had a soul mark like his. Izuku had seen it one day in gym class, on his shoulder blade. It sat, unmoving, at midnight. Admittedly, Izuku had been so excited that he'd approached him about it rather directly, not realizing it was a terribly sensitive subject for the other kid. After a lot of apologies and some time, they slowly absorbed him into their friend group. You shouldn't put up with a bad roommate just because you like your room. He's not a bad roommate, Kaken's clean, and after the first night he mostly uses headphones to listen to his music and doesn't usually bother me very much aside from nagging about cleaning. He's actually out a decent amount too, so dash. Yeah, but it sounds like his personality is so sour. You totally deserve someone better. Uraraka stuck out her tongue in distaste, making Izuku laugh. Come on, you haven't even met him before dash. Don't defend him. She shouted back, insistent. If Uraraka was anything, she was Izuku's biggest cheerleader. Izuku shook his head. I'm not. Sour is definitely the right word. I'm just saying, I could always end up with someone worse, you know? I'm just going to play it by ear for a while, okay? Yeah, Tsu piped up. I think Izuku is doing the right thing. It sounds like things could be worse. My roommate is fine, but there's this guy a floor above us. He's terrible. He keeps wandering into the bathroom on the girls' floor. No way. Izuku sighed, grateful for her change of subject. They all latched on to the new topic, listening to Tsu's stories of woe and perverts. Ida, in particular, took great offense to this clear violation of school rules. When their food arrived, they did a bit of a round-robin style of discussion, taking turns to update each other on their roommates and their new classes. It was the best Izuku had felt all week, full of warm food and comforted by being back with his friends again, rather than tiptoeing around someone who reminded him so much of the past and seemed to find fault in everything he did. They stayed out late together, hopping between each other's dorms to show them off. Izuku was amazed and relieved to find Bakugou wasn't home and asleep already, but he figured it was a Friday night. Bakugou seemed to have friends on campus as well. They ended the night playing card games in the lounge of Tsu and Uraraka's dorm, not wanting to make the ladies walk home in the. It was around 2 a.m. when Izuku got back to his own dorm again, surprised when he could see the light was still on. Regardless, he made an effort to open the door quietly and poked his head in first, only to see Bakugou sitting on his bed and tugging his socks off. The blonde looked up at him, his eyes a little unfocused, and then the vague smell of alcohol hit Izuku's nose. Izuku couldn't help but smile, finally getting some proof that Bakugou was a typical college student after all. Hey Kaken. Were you at a party? Shut the F up, don't want to hear it from a nerd like you. Probably doing boring shit all night, fucking nerd, he grumbled, shifting in his bed to get under the covers. He was a bit too tipsy to bother changing his clothes, apparently, despite that they clearly smelled like beer. Turn the effing light off too, sheet. He wasn't very articulate when he'd been drinking, was he? In a minute, Izuku replied, pulling off his shoes in the doorway. He was going to change into pajamas, anyways, since he hadn't been drinking all night. He took his time doing so, biting his lip to keep from laughing aloud as Bakugou shifted restlessly in his bed, clearly feeling impatient about the whole light situation but unwilling to get out of bed himself. It wasn't much in the way of revenge, but it was kind of funny to see Bakugou like this, silently and drunkenly fuming at him. After a few minutes, Izuku had mercy and turned the light switch off before he went to the bathroom to brush his teeth. When he finally crawled into his own bed, he could hear his roommate's breathing had evened and he'd clearly passed out. He'd never taken Bakugou to be the type to go out to parties. He came off as though he always felt above all of that kind of stuff, so it did leave Izuku wondering who on earth had the magical power to convince the Katsuki Bakugou to go out. He figured it wasn't really much to concern himself with. Maybe this sort of thing helped Bakugou unwind and he definitely wasn't going to interfere with that whole process. Izuku shifted on his mattress, the cheap springs creaking under his weight. It didn't take long before he also passed out, first week of college under his belt. He felt this was no small feat considering the challenge he'd been given, namely, the grumpy childhood friend sleeping roughly 7 feet away. The answer to Izuku's question as to who had the magical power to convince Bakugou to go out to a party came in the form of a red-headed boy who knocked on their door early Saturday morning. Okay, to be fair, it wasn't that early. It was 9 a.m., but for a college student that may as well have been at daybreak. Even Bakugou, surprisingly, had the sense to sleep in on a Saturday. And by sense, Izuku definitely meant that he was almost certainly hungover, judging from the fact that he'd seen him get up around 8, shuffle to the bathroom, and then down 2 ibuprofen before diving back under his covers. Izuku ended up being the one to open the door after Bakugou threw his spare pillow at it, grumbling a complaint about the loud knocking and how it needed to shut the hell up. "Oh hey, is Bakugou in?" the man on the other side of the door asked, looking down warily at the pillow on the ground. He'd probably heard the thud moments ago and put 2 and 2 together. Izuku's voice was quiet, and he glanced back at the lump of sheets on the bed, knowing Bakugou was under them, but "Fucking, tell him to go away, useless, shitty Deku," a disdainful voice called out from under the duvet. Bakugou must have known who was at the door based on voice alone. Izuku briefly wondered if it was a friend that Bakugou had made back in high school. Whoever they were also clearly familiar with Bakugou's brand of grouchy. Izuku and him exchanged knowing looks before Izuku stepped aside, gesturing for the other to come inside. "I'm Izuku Midoriya, by the way. Kaken's roommate." "Kaken?" "He means me, hair for brains." Bakugou poked his head out from his blankets and propped himself up on his elbows, eyes squinting at the sudden brightness of the room assaulting his senses. After a moment he glared at Izuku. "Deku, you're a sheet doorman. Good thing I'm not paid to take your visitors then, right?" "Pfuff." "Kaken?" the redhead echoed, still stuck on that. It was easy to forget sometimes that not everyone called Bakugou by that nickname. Izuku had just been in the habit in his younger years. It was likely that Bakugou had never mentioned or brought up the childish nickname to anyone else. "Don't you dare start that bad habit, Kirishima. Why are you here?" "Oh shit, wait." The redhead turned to Izuku with a sudden sense of urgency. "I totally forgot to introduce myself. I'm Kirishima Ijiro. Bakugou was so tight-lipped about his new roommate last night. It's cool to meet you." Kirishima extended his hand, grinning widely. He had weirdly sharp-looking teeth, but his affectation was so kind and excitable that it wasn't off-putting in the least. Izuku returned the smile and held out his hand as well, the other giving it a very firm and confident shake in return. He looked Izuku in the eye as he did so, as though he was scrutinizing him. After a moment, he clasped his other hand over Izuku's and nodded in approval. "You've got a good, strong handshake, man. Good on ya. You gonna even make out with him too, or can I go back to bed?" Bakugou grunted, not exactly excited to be dealing with this exchange right now. Izuku couldn't help but grimace, cheeks turning a bit red at the implication, but Kirishima took it in stride and laughed. "Come on, man. You've way overslept, it's so late already." Bakugou snarled and grabbed the pillow under his arms this time, flinging it violently at the redhead. The other man caught it with ease and just grinned, unperturbed by the aggression. He must have been a close friend no one who was new to hanging around Bakugou was so accepting of. His angry outbursts. "Children, we're all gonna go get brunch at a cafe. I just figured I'd stop by and drag your butt out with us, since your dorm is on my route anyways." Bakugou flopped down on his sad, pillowless bed, head buried in his folded arms now instead. "You should have just texted me, idiot. You wouldn't have answered." Bakugou groaned again, and then went quiet. Kirishima glanced at Izuku. "Yo, Midoriya, you wanna come too? Everyone wants to know who Bakugou's mysterious unnamed roomie is. Bakugou won't say a word about you, and we're all dying for some deets." Izuku had no idea who the hypothetical "we" in this situation was, presumably, a group of friends Bakugou belonged to? It was hard to wrap his head around it. Bakugou was universally loved back in their childhood. People admired him, people looked up to him, people were impressed and terrified, but they generally weren't his friends. After a certain age, Bakugou had all but forsaken friendship. People stuck with him and followed him around, sure, but it was clear they were not his friends. Kirishima, though? Kirishima was definitely a friend. That much was clear. He wondered what else had changed about Bakugou in the 4 years they hadn't seen each other. Izuku had assumed not much, given his current behavior, but he was starting to think maybe he'd been quick to judge. I'd love to, but are you sure no one else would mind, Kirishima? I don't want to intrude. Bakugou interrupted him. Yeah, you shithead, you can't just invite my roommate without fucking asking anyone else. What's wrong with you? It was clear at least one person minded, then. But Kirishima was insistent, smacking Izuku's back with his hand in a friendly manner that may or may not have actually hurt a little. Come on, man. I'm sure everyone's chill with it. You can get to know the little green dude better over some crepes at the cafe. Now get up and shower, you stink like shit and we gotta get going soon. Bakugou was out of ammunition on his bed after throwing his 2 pillows, so instead he settled for launching a verbal onslaught of curses and insults Kirishima's way. The other brushed them off with ease, mostly just ignoring them. Disgruntled, Bakugou tore himself from his sheets and gathered up his things to go shower the scent of sweat and stale beer off himself. It was eerily quiet the moment Bakugou slammed the door shut behind him, leaving Izuku alone with Kirishima. Izuku shuffled his feet awkwardly, not liking the sudden silence. So, do you not want something to drink? I'm good. Kirishima chirped, totally unaffected by any perceived awkwardness. He lifted his water bottle towards Izuku in a little cheers motion and then took a few gulps from it. I run in this area in the mornings when I can. I live off campus with some of the others, but it's nicer here. Oh, where do you run around here? Are there any good parks or anything? Izuku knew that running was a topic he could keep up with, at least. He gestured for them to sit down in his and Bakugou's desk chairs so they weren't just standing around awkwardly. As they sat down, Izuku continued, I'm still so unfamiliar with the area. Back in high school I did track, so I've been hoping to get back into dash. Kirishima was looking at him with bright, excited eyes now. Whoa. No way, I did track too. What did you do? Izuku shrugged, feeling embarrassed suddenly. Oh, a bit of everything. I was best at sprints and I broke all of the jumping records at my school. We were a small school though, so that's not really saying much, to be honest. Don't sell yourself short. That's awesome. Bakugou was always obsessed with trying to break school records for the weight room too, Kirishima laughed. The way he talked about Bakugou with such ease was fascinating. Izuku found another opening and jumped on it, wanting to steer away from talking about his own records. You and Kaken went to high school together? That's how you met him. Yeah. We actually played soccer together. And wrestling for a year, but Bakugou got kicked off the team for being way too aggressive with the other kids and it wasn't really fun without him, so I quit too. So, yeah, just soccer after that. Low contact, easier for him to keep from punching other kids. Not that it always stopped him. He almost got kicked off the volleyball team one year too. Izuku snorted out a laugh, finding it too easy to imagine that. He hadn't seen Bakugou do any school sports back in middle school, but their last year had been when he'd started working out in earnest, so it made sense that it extended to sports later on in high school. He was not surprised that Bakugou didn't exactly possess the necessary sportsmanship to do well in the athletics department. So, Kaken? Kirishima asked again, and Izuku filled in the unspoken gaps to figure out this was his way of asking how Izuku had met Bakugou. Right. I forget, that sounds weird to most people, I've just been saying it for so long. It was his nickname back in, kindergarten. Izuku rubbed the back of his neck nervously. Bakugou was going to kill him, definitely, if he found out he was talking about their childhood behind his back. Still, it would be rude to ignore Kirishima's question. He decided that maybe keeping things vague for now would be the best course. We lived in the same neighborhood when we were younger. Our moms were friends, actually, so we kinda grew up together, that's all. Oh, so you two were childhood friends? Friends, that isn't the right word, necessarily. Izuku tried to explain, not wanting to make it sound complicated or weird when it was, in fact, both of those things and more. Kirishima raised an eyebrow, but he seemed more interested in pursuing another line of thought. Okay, but that means you have stories from when he was a kid, right? I guess? But no wonder he didn't want to tell us about you. Sheet Midria, don't say. Another word. Save it all for brunch. The others are gonna lose their minds when they find this out. You are about to be the life of this get-together, my dude. Kirishima reached over and gently punched Izuku's shoulder. No, there's no way. Do you want me to die, Kirishima? I don't think you really understand, but Kaken will absolutely kill me if I dash. The door to their room opened, revealing Bakugou in a fresh set of clothes, towels slung over his shoulder and a carrier full of toiletries in his hand. He looked more awake but no less set off, currently glaring at Izuku. I'll kill you if you do what, Deku? The color drained from Izuku's face slightly, and he held up his hands in defense. Nothing, nothing. We weren't talking about anything, right, Kirishima? Nope. Nothing at all. The redhead threw him a wholly unconvincing wink, and Izuku could have buried his face in his palms for how not subtle this man was. Bakugou's gaze lingered on Izuku for a few seconds longer, before he made a small, teeth, noise and hung the damp towel up on a hook by his closet. Whatever. Let's just get this over with, I guess. Bakugou paused and glanced back at his roommate. Well? If you're coming, aren't you going to get dressed, idiot? Izuku blinked at him and then looked down at himself. He was still wearing an old, oversized t-shirt with a vintage comic book cover from his favorite superhero series screen printed on it and a pair of plaid pajama pants. He'd honestly gotten so distracted by his conversation with Kirishima that he'd totally forgotten. Izuku practically jumped up from his chair and moved to his dresser to pull out an outfit for the day, before running to the bathroom to change. He didn't normally do that last part, but he figured Kirishima was technically a guest, so it would probably be weird to change right in front of him. It only took a minute or so for Izuku to make himself presentable, and soon they were taking the elevators down to the lobby. They walked side by side, with Kirishima in the middle to guide them via Google Maps to the small cafe where they were supposed to be meeting some other people. The whole time, Bakugou looked furious with Izuku. He was pleasant enough when it came to Kirishima, though he never lost that rough edge he was known for, but Izuku's presence seemed to be ticking him off. Izuku got the distinct feeling that Bakugou had only been okay with letting Izuku tag along because Kirishima had insisted. It was a weird feeling. He knew Bakugou hated him, but it was undeniable that things had also changed. Seeing a glimpse of this Bakugou, a Bakugou with friends who cared enough to coordinate brunches with him, a Bakugou who seemed to sometimes give in to the whims of someone else, it was enlightening. Bakugou had changed in a lot of little ways that were so hard to notice at first. Izuku knew that objectively he had as well, and he definitely didn't have the right to find this so surprising. Everyone changed from the end of middle school to their freshman year of college. Everyone changed after 4 long years. It was inevitable. But it was weird to acknowledge it too. There were pieces of Bakugou's life that Izuku had just entirely missed, and Kirishima was living proof of that. And then, Izuku noted as Bakugou hurled another set of vulgarities at his red-headed friend who'd apparently taken them down a wrong turn, there were equally as many pieces that had remained totally and completely static. Katsuki Bakugou was still very much Katsuki Bakugou. At brunch, Izuku was introduced to 3 other people. Mina Ishido, a tanned woman with wild pink hair and an outlandish fashion sense of clashing patterns. Denki Kaminari, a guy with medium-length blonde hair in a black leather jacket and a kind of electric, excitable energy about him. Hantashiro, a guy with flat black hair and a toothy grin who waved eagerly at them when they first came through the door. They had saved 2 extra chairs, but when they saw Midoriya they immediately began asking the other tables around them if they could steal any open chairs and, eventually, they managed to grab one from someone who was sitting alone with their laptop at a corner table. Kirishima had let Izuku sit in his place, and instead pulled the new chair between Ishido and Kaminari for himself. Come on, Bakugou, you gotta introduce Midoriya to everyone. I think you just did, Kirishima. Bakugou sighed, but then made a vague gesture between Izuku and the others. Deku, everyone. Everyone, Deku. Midoriya. Izuku Midoriya, please. I'm Kadata, Bakugou's roommate. In the end, Kirishima ended up introducing the others to Izuku, with Bakugou too busy looking engrossed by the slim menu pamphlet that had been placed on the table. Who chose this place? Everything looks so dim and sweet. Bakugou glanced around the table briefly. Ishido chose it. Don't look at me, Kaminari chimed in, voice a bit defensive. Hey! Ashido pouted, puffing out her cheeks angrily. You all agreed. I even sent the menu out ahead of time, you traitors. Besides, this place has a crepe with this kind of caramelized sugar coating and a cream brulee filling that is literally to die for. I didn't even think you liked sweets that much, Ashido, Siro chimed in, not looking up from his own menu. I don't. That's how you know it's good. Besides, they have savory crepes too, Bakugou. Ashido stuck her tongue out at the blonde, who responded by giving her the finger. She gasped in mock surprise. Izuku felt the whole scene was so surreal. It was that same sense that he'd missed something that he'd gotten earlier. Bakugou really, truly, had an entire group of friends who did normal friend things, like teasing each other and going out to brunch. They were all seemingly nice and normal people who put up with his grouchy roommate, and in turn, Bakugou put up with all of them. No, Bakugou wasn't the kind of person to settle. He wouldn't have come if he didn't at least enjoy their company a little. Somehow, they'd all chipped away at him and found something decent deep down. Izuku wanted to know everything. He studied every interaction they had a bit too intently. He almost missed when Kaminari called his name. So tell us, Midoriya, what's Bakugou like as a roommate? He never even invited us over to his house back in high school. Huh. Izuku blinked at the blonde currently addressing him, and then glanced at the other blonde currently staring daggers at him. Oh, it's fine, I guess. Kaken's fine. A neat freak. Bakugou sat up straight at that and gripped the edge of the table. Just 'cause you're willing to live in filth doesn't mean I have to sink so low, Deku. Kaken, not wanting to sweep the floor every single night is more normal than you think it is, I promise dash. Who the F is Kaken? Ashido deadpanned, raising an eyebrow and breaking the tension between the two of them instantly. They both looked at her, and then back at each other. Bakugou's eyebrows furrowed as though he were weighing his options for explaining things or not while simultaneously daring Izuku to say anything. As it turned out, Kirishima chimed in first. They were childhood friends. The words practically burst from his mouth, like he'd been waiting to spill this at the exact right moment. As predicted, the whole table broke into various shocked reactions. What? No way! Siro exclaimed, with that being the calmest of them. Kaminari immediately reached over the table and grabbed Izuku's shoulders so tight that he could feel his nails digging into his skin through his shirt. Tell us everything, Midoriya. Detail. Spill the deets. Ashido cheered, raising a fist in the air in her excitement. Do you have baby pictures? There's nothing to tell really, guys. Izuku insisted, right before a nice waitress came by to take their collective orders and just barely saved Izuku's butt. It gave them all time enough to calm down so that, at least when they jumped back to the topic, no one had a death grip on him. Okay, so Kaminari's hands were quickly replaced by Bakugou's, his grip so tight that his knuckles were turning white. Izuku wasn't sure this was any better. It felt like a thinly veiled threat, where if he said the wrong thing, his shoulder might be dislocated. Seriously, Kaken though? We never get to call him cute nicknames. Ashido crossed her arms, though Izuku didn't really understand why that's such an issue. That's what I said. Kirishima threw his arms into the air, exasperated. Remember when I tried to get Baku to stick, but he wouldn't even have that. That wasn't even like a cutesy thing. It's just his name. This whole time we should have stuck with Kaken. Apparently that was what they used to call him as a kid. How do you feel about that, Kaken? Siro teased, eyes squinting in a grin as he laughed. Izuku felt the grip on his shoulder tighten further. Any of you call me that one more time, I'll cut your demon tongues out so that you never get to call me or anyone else anything ever again, PRD. Got it? Izuku had a distinct feeling that threat didn't apply to him considering he'd been calling Bakugou, Kaken, for over a week now without issue, but he'd avoid saying it for a while anyways. Don't you have any embarrassing stories to tell, Midoriya? Kaminari asked, his eyes gleaming with hope. This a-hole's always trying to seem better than all of us. It'd be great to finally get some dirt on him. Izuku chewed his lower lip in thought for just a moment. Well, there was this one time. Ow. Izuku winced and turned to look over at Bakugou, then down at the hand on his shoulder. Nails. What the hell was it with everyone trying to dig their nails into his skin today? Never mind, nope. I don't have any amusing, mortifying stories about him. None at all, Izuku insisted, finally shifting slightly and using two of his hands to try and pry Bakugou's death grip from his shoulder. Bakugou snatched his hand away, as though offended that he'd been touched at all. Izuku couldn't help but roll his eyes and keep talking, and I definitely won't tell you guys later when I'm not under duress by a certain someone. So don't ask me later. I know where you live, Deku. Well gee, I sure hope so, Rumi. Don't get smart with me, you motherfucker dash. The server came over with their food in that moment, placing the plates of various crepes around the table. It was enough of a distraction to settle them all down a bit again. Thank goodness for food service, which had effectively saved Izuku twice this morning. I like him, Kirishima. Ashido laughed, elbowing the redhead playfully. You did good picking Midoriya up. I can't wait to hear all those stories about itty-bitty Bakugou dash. Yeah, I just hope Bakugou doesn't actually try to kill him at any point, Kirishima replied, his own laugh a lot more nervous as he eyed his friend across the table. Bakugou stabbed his fork into the crepe hard enough that the metal screeched against the porcelain in a wholly unpleasant manner. Ah, come on, it seems like Midoriya's been dealing with Bakugou's bullshit longer than any of us. Kaminari rolled his eyes, picking up his smoothie and sking at the colorful straw. All of you, I am a goddamn delight. Bakugou huffed, waving the forkful of food at his friends before popping it in his mouth. There was a hint of amusement to his tone that was new, subtle enough that Izuku almost missed it. It helped him relax and start eating his own food, chewing quietly as the rest of them picked the conversation back up. Clearly, they weren't going to be able to squeeze any details out of Izuku while Bakugou was around, so they moved on. Off the topic of his childhood, Bakugou was a lot more tame. He was much more relaxed and even laughed a couple times. The sound was so foreign to Izuku, it had been so many years since he'd heard. Not since they were kids. But he wasn't about to say as much. The walk home together was more tense than Izuku wished. They'd parted ways with the others at the cafe. Their off-campus place was in the opposite direction, so it just left the two of them to walk back to their dorm alone. After a few moments, Izuku managed to think of something to talk about. Say, Kaken, why didn't you live off-campus with them? And give up the swanky honors dorms we got? The place they rent is a dump compared to our place. Besides, I think I'd literally kill one of them by the end of month one. Probably Ashido. Girl fucking leaves a trail of her belongings behind her wherever she goes. Ah, that makes sense. Yeah, it would've, Bakugou huffed, shoving his hands into his pockets and absently kicking a rock down the sidewalk. Except I got stuck with someone just as fucking bad. Guess it was always a gamble, but still. Shitty, nerdy Deku. Never thought I'd see your ugly mug again, to be honest. Izuku glanced over at Bakugou. Behind the rudeness, the sentiment was still there. He was actually admitting to the fact that, if nothing else, he really was surprised to see Izuku after all these years. Izuku smiled and let out a soft, breathy laugh. The hell you laughing at, huh? Nothing, nothing. You're just still so, you know? Beef? Else am I gonna be? Bakugou looked over at him, the corners of his mouth tugged down into a scowl. Ah, never mind. I was just thinking too much. For a beat, Bakugou didn't say anything. He pursed his lips and seemed to study Izuku for a sign of what he was thinking, but as per usual, he didn't dwell. If Izuku thought too much, then Bakugou preferred to be just the opposite. That's always been your demon problem, nerd. Bakugou brought a hand up and waved it lazily at Izuku as they approached an intersection. Anyways, I've got homework to do. Gonna go to the library. See ya. Oh, okay, I'll see you back at the dorm, Kaken. Good luck. Izuku waved back, and then hurried across the street when he noticed the light was about to change. After he'd crossed the road and made it a few more blocks, it hit Izuku that their conversation just now had actually been relatively normal. At least Bakugou hadn't spent the entirety of it yelling at him. So, yeah, normal by their standards. That was improvement, right? No, Uraraka, we need to do chapter 3 for the next class. I wrote it down on my agenda, see? Ah, geez, I spent an hour reading chapter 4 earlier. Are you sure, Midoriya? Uraraka scrunched up her nose, suddenly rolling over on the bed and reaching for her backpack on the floor to fish out her copy of the syllabus. She flipped through the pages quickly and then solemnly returned it to her bag, defeated and grumbling, "Ugh, no wonder it was so confusing. We can work on Chapter 3 together, don't worry. Besides, I'm sure we'll be doing Chapter 4 sooner or later, so it's not like you wasted your time, per se," Izuku offered, smiling softly at his brunette friend. She looked exhausted already, and they were only on week 3 of their classes. "Come on, let's get it over with." Uraraka groaned and sat up, her hair sticking up a bit wildly from leaning over the bed. She puffed her cheeks out in a pout. "I hate biology so much." "You're on the wrong career path, then," Izuku hummed, opening the heavy textbook in his lap. Uraraka nodded in agreement, but rubbed her fingers together in the universal sign for money. "Yeah, but being a doctor is just so lucrative. Diamenu, 6-figure salary, you devious temptress. I still think you need to find a better motive than that." "Oh, shut up. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be able to buy my parents a nice condo on a tropical island when they retire. Helping people is just a nice plus." Uraraka stuck her tongue out at Izuku for good measure before following suit and pulling out her own notebook and textbook. "Besides, we can't all have untainted hearts of gold, Mr. Pediatrician." "That's Dr. Pediatrician to you, Uraraka." "Not yet it isn't," she said with a laugh, kicking Izuku's leg playfully. Soon they both settled in and began reading the chapter separately, asking each other questions once in a while if they didn't understand something. After about an hour, Izuku heard the door knob of their room twist, followed by the door itself opening. "Hey Kaken," Izuku said casually, not looking up from his book. Uraraka's legs were draped over his lap currently, but she moved to sit upright the moment Bakugou walked in. Izuku looked up at that, shaken from his focus, and put his book down. He'd almost been too distracted by the reading to remember that Bakugou had never met Uraraka. Izuku was about to apologize and introduce them, but Uraraka was already climbing off of his bed and packing up her things. She'd heard all of the stories about Bakugou and decided a while ago that she didn't like him very much. "I'm gonna get going. I think Tsu said she wanted to get dinner tonight. We can finish the chapter tomorrow before class, right? Let's meet at the library at 10 to do the questions." Uraraka, you don't have to go," Izuku said, glancing at Bakugou, who grunted in agreement as he pulled his shoes off. "Yeah, fucking stay if you want, round face." Izuku froze. Excuse me?" Uraraka said, turning slowly as she slung her backpack over her shoulder. She was smiling pleasantly, but Izuku had known her long enough to know that it was a thinly veiled facade of politeness, and behind that veil she was furious. "I said you can fucking stay, it doesn't bother me," Bakugou repeated, putting his own bag down and taking off his hoodie, hardly even paying attention to their visitor. Izuku practically launched himself off the bed and jumped between the two of them, putting his hand on Uraraka's upper arm in what he hoped was a calming gesture. This was not helping her predisposition for disliking Bakugou. He needed to reboot this whole encounter, start over. Kaken, this is Uraraka Ochako, she's a friend of mine from high school. I invited her over to do our biology homework dash." "Didn't ask," Bakugou said, only briefly looking over his shoulder at both of them. "And Uraraka, this is my roommate Bakugou Katsuki." Izuku finished, lamely. So much for his hope of diffusing the situation. Uraraka's face briefly flared with anger, and she looked at Izuku as though she wanted permission to punch Bakugou. Uraraka was no weakling, she worked out pretty regularly and did her fair share of martial arts, but Izuku very much did not want a fistfight to break out in his room. "Okay," Izuku said, loudly, pronouncing each syllable. He laughed nervously and tugged at Uraraka's sleeve, guiding her gently to the door. He handed her her jacket. "It's getting late. Let's do like you said and meet at the library tomorrow morning." "Come on, I'll walk you out, Uraraka," Izuku insisted, and luckily, his friend did not protest. In the elevator, however, she exploded, "Round face?" Izuku sighed, exasperated. I know. I'm sorry. He's kind of an a-hole most of the time. He's not great with names." "Midoriya." I don't think I've ever met someone that outwardly rude before, and I have a job waitressing. I know. I'm sorry. I want to say he gets better when you get to know him, but that he's just not kind of like that. Boys. I've told you that before. Izuku shook his head. God, I'm sorry, I didn't realize he'd be so rude to you so immediately. It's not your fault, Midoriya. Stop apologizing. Uraraka sent him a stern, meaningful glance. He opened his mouth to apologize again, but quickly shut himself up. Uraraka gave a resigned sigh. It's fine. I'm fine. If he wants to be angry and mean, that's his problem. Yeah, that's the spirit. I still can't believe you put up with that kind of personality, though. Izuku was quiet for a moment, then gave a small shrug. The dorm is pretty cool though, right? Uraraka looked suddenly crestfallen, voice whiny when she spoke. Your furniture is nicer than the stuff we have back home, you scholarship-winning J. The mood between them had lightened considerably by the time they got to the lobby and out onto the street, Uraraka's anger with Bakugou fading slowly with the distance gained from him. Uraraka gave him a quick hug before setting off down the street towards her own dorm building. Izuku waited until she was out of sight before heading back to his room, muttering about the other homework he needed to start tonight. When he got back inside, Bakugou was sitting with his feet up on his desk, relaxed in his chair. He was on his phone, a textbook unopened in front of him for the moment. Izuku kicked off his shoes and stared at the other for a moment, as if expecting a greeting or an apology for his rudeness, or something. Bakugou didn't look up at him, his thumbs tapping at the screen mindlessly. Izuku wanted to say something but decided against it last minute. It probably wasn't worth getting into it with him. An apology was far too much to expect. Instead, he just flopped down on his bed and looked over his agenda to start planning the rest of the week's workload. He was in the middle of giving each assignment a deadline when Bakugou spoke up. So, friend from high school? Izuku looked at him, jumping slightly with the sudden break in the silence. Bakugou himself had finally looked up from his phone, too, a bored expression on his face. Oh, we met freshman year. She was the first friend I made after moving away. Izuku shrugged a bit, turning back to his task at hand. He figured that would be the end of it, but to his surprise Bakugou kept the conversation going. The hell was her problem, anyways? Running out the moment I came in. Izuku looked up again, and just barely missed the tail end of what might have been an almost suspicious glance. Suspicious? But what? There was absolutely no way Bakugou would have known that he'd told Uraraka everything about their childhood together, that she knew all the horror stories about their relationship in middle school. It was impossible, and yet the way Bakugou was looking at him made him think that he'd started to figure it out on his own. Izuku may have known the reason behind her anger, but there was no way Bakugou could have guessed it, right? It made him feel a bit panicky, well aware that the other probably wouldn't be happy to find out he'd been talking about him behind his back. Well, you weren't exactly nice to her either, Kaken. You called her round face before you even knew her name. Izuku deflected, voice only slightly betraying how worried he was. So? Her face is round. Nothing rude about the truth. Izuku sent him an exhausted look. You sure have a way of making the truth sound rude. Then you think her face is round too? What? No, Izuku shook his head, realizing the implications of what he'd just said. In it. Bakugou hid a snicker behind his hand, clearly feeling proud of himself. Izuku rolled his eyes and refused to respond further. He was determined to get back to his agenda and week planning. Just text me next time if you're having someone over and want to be left alone, okay? Idiot. Izuku blinked at the agenda in front of his eyes, tapping his pen against it intently and trying to force himself to focus and ignore whatever annoying thing Bakugou was saying now. Wait, what? Izuku felt his cheeks heat up suddenly and he almost got whiplash from how quickly he looked up at the blonde across the room. Was that the reason Bakugou had been eyeing him suspiciously earlier? It was almost a relief, if it hadn't been such an embarrassing mistake for a multitude of reasons that Izuku didn't really want to get into right now. No, that wasn't, we were just doing biology homework together. Seriously, she's like a sister to me, you can't just assume things like that. Besides, she has a girlfriend. Oh, Bakugou looked confused. He seemed to have been pretty certain he'd had it all figured out, but the firm shutdown from Izuku had proved him wrong, and he hated being wrong. Then why the hell did she storm off in such a huff? Izuku feigned innocence and shrugged. I guess she got caught up in reading and just forgot that she was supposed to meet her girlfriend for dinner, so she might have been running late for that? I don't know. Bakugou's eyes lingered on him. He could feel his gaze even when he went back to working on organizing his agenda. It was clear he didn't quite buy that excuse, but he had believed what Izuku said about her absolutely not being anything of a romantic interest. He was trying to calculate the real reason Uraraka seemed so adverse to meeting him, but he didn't seem to dwell on it for long before he threw his phone on his bed and flipped open his own textbook. Silently, they both kept on with their work. It was a Wednesday night that Izuku received the following text. Unknown number, hey Midoriya. Stole your number from Bakugou's phone, hope you don't mind. There's gonna be a house party Friday night. Come around 10. Bring friends? Text you the address in a sec. Unknown number, this is Kirishima BTW. Izuku was grateful for the last clarifying text, since the first one gave no context whatsoever. A moment later his phone buzzed again, and another text with the promised address appeared in the conversation. Izuku added Kirishima to his contacts and replied, promptly. Midoriya? Hello Kirishima. That sounds fun, I'll see if any of my friends wanna come. I'm sure they'd all love to meet you guys. Smiley face. Who else is coming? Kirishima, everyone will be there. Even Bakugou, but maybe don't mention that I invited you yet. He doesn't know I stole his phone and took your number. Kirishima, he has you listed as fucking Deku. It took forever for me to find your contact LMAO. Izuku frowned at his phone, then looked over at Bakugou, who was currently sleeping. It was close to midnight and Izuku had just come back from the study lounge on their floor, having been kicked out of their room earlier due to Bakugou's apparent need to maximize his beauty sleep. Even in his phone contacts, Bakugou couldn't resist a jab. Huh? It didn't surprise him, to be honest. Izuku sighed and began tapping his thumbs across the keypad on his phone. Midoriya, does he not want me there? Kirishima took a while to reply to this text. Comparatively. Kirishima, no, that's not it. He just gets weird when I mention you sometimes. But like DWABT it, dude. Just come and have a good time. Midoriya, weird how? Kirishima, ah man, I shouldn't have said anything. It's just Bakugou being Bakugou, you know? He's weird and angry about everything else. Midoriya, well, if you're sure it's fine for me to come, I'll be there with some of the others if they can make it. Izuku took a moment to send out an invite to the group chat he had going with his friends from high school, making sure to specifically tag Todoroki, since it was unlikely he'd see the message in the morning otherwise. He tucked his phone away onto his desk after silencing it and plugging it into charge, and then rolled onto his stomach and hugged his pillow to his face. He'd spent most of his weekends so far bouncing between small friend hangouts, working out, and doing school assignments, he'd not branched out much further than his own friends at this point. Bakugou's friends had been nice, but until now they hadn't really reached out to him much beyond some social media friend requests. Kirishima seemed to be the one extending the olive branch once again, but that made sense given his apparent closeness to Bakugou, who was really the only connecting thread between them at the moment. That meant that this was going to be his first college party. He wasn't nervous or anything thought. Okay, no, that was a lie. He was nervous. It wasn't like he'd never been to parties before, but these kinds of situations always made him slightly anxious. He'd have to pick out something to wear, he'd have to work on introducing himself to people, and remember how to make good small talk if he ever got left alone with a stranger. He was sincerely hoping that at least some of his high school friends were going to be able to make it. If they were there, he'd have an excuse to just be antisocial in a corner with them should things go south at any point. He wasn't bad with people or anything, he just preferred not going into these kinds of things alone. He buried his face in his pillow and willed himself to brush off the tiny prickles of anxiety in his brain so that he could sleep. Izuku woke up that morning to 87 unread messages in his high school group chat. Groggily, he unplugged his phone and rolled onto his back, scrolling back up to his last message. Ida had been the first to reply that he couldn't make it that Friday, he was going to be visiting his brother. But it seemed that Tsu, Uraraka, and Todoroki were going to be able to make it. Todoroki's status was still a bit up in the air. His response had been a very non-committal thumbs-up emoji, which Izuku chose to interpret as an affirmation. Izuku finally caught up to reading all the messages and joined the conversation, mentioning that Tsu and Uraraka's dorm was closer to the address that Kirishima had sent him. Todoroki and him agreed to meet the other two at their building and walk together from there. Izuku felt a bit rude not inviting Bakugou to come with them, since they'd be heading in the same direction anyways, but Kirishima had been insistent that he not mention anything to him. Izuku assumed he was afraid Bakugou might not want to go if he knew he'd be there, which was a little disheartening, but understandable given their shaky relationship. Thursday passed quickly to Friday, and soon enough Izuku was muttering to himself in front of the shared full-length mirror hanging on the back of their dorm room. He was inspecting his third outfit change of the evening. He'd started off wearing a dress shirt and a nice sweater but decided that was too formal and stuffy, nerdy, Bakugou would have said, so he'd switched to an oversized t-shirt but it looked too much like pajamas. The superhero-themed hoodie he was wearing currently also made him look like he was heading to an 8 a.m. class and had given up on trying to look good, so he tugged that off as well, thoroughly disgruntled. He tossed the article onto his bed and began looking through his closet again, pulling out a baseball tee. It was white with gray sleeves and had a slim fit when he put it on, unlike most of his other clothing. He mostly lived his life in various forms of loose-fitting lounge and athletic wear, so it was weird to see himself in the mirror with jeans and a decent-looking shirt that actually did something to show off that he had a muscular build. Most of all, though, he noticed that this shirt was only quarter-sleeved. It easily showed off his soul mark, and he tugged uncomfortably at the hem of the fabric. He used to avoid shorter sleeves altogether when he was younger. In the summer, on particularly hot days, he'd just wrap his forearm in bandages, but that was usually more trouble than it was worth. As he'd gotten older it had gotten less and less weird to have a timed-out soul mark, so he didn't mind it as much nowadays. On most days, he had no problem showing off his soul mark. But just knowing he'd be doing a lot of socializing tonight made him feel anxious about it all over again. A moment later, the doorknob twisted and Izuku had to hop backwards to avoid being hit as the door swung open, effectively cutting off his access to the mirror. Bakugou blinked at him, surprised to see him standing right in front of the doorway. He gave Izuku a once-over, raising an eyebrow. "You going out?" "Oh yeah," Izuku nodded, not exactly feeling any more comfortable in these clothes now that someone was looking at him. The fact that it was Bakugou made it worse. Subconsciously, he turned his forearm inward towards himself, shielding his soul mark from view. There's a party dash. And then a moment later, Todoroki appeared in the doorway behind Bakugou. "Midoriya, you were supposed to be in the lobby 15 minutes ago." Bakugou spun around, cursing loudly in surprise. "Who the hell are you?" "Oh, hello. Todoroki Shoto. I'm a friend of Midoriya's. And you must be Bakugou Katsuki, Midoriya's roommate." Bakugou stared for a moment before pushing his way past Izuku into their room. "Yeah, that's me." Todoroki, unlike Uraraka, seemed mostly unbothered by the rude behavior. Instead, he turned back to Midoriya and picked up where he left off. "Anyways, we should get going. Uraraka was wondering in the chat room if you were getting hung up on your clothes, so I came up to check on you. Your outfit looks nice though." "Oh, thanks," Izuku said, trying not to show the obvious relief the brief compliment brought. Todoroki didn't exactly have a way with words, but when he spoke he was honest, so it was comforting enough to convince Izuku to grab his wallet and keys and pull his shoes on. "See ya, Kaken." The other only waved his hand in acknowledgement, busy gathering his things for a shower. Izuku shut the door behind him and glanced at his phone. It was already past 9:30, so he hoped Tsu and Uraraka would at least be ready to go when they got there. He quickly opened their chat and told them they were on their way as they got into the elevator. When they arrived at their dorm, Uraraka and Tsu were waiting for them outside the building, holding hands and ready to start walking right away. Tsu was wearing a cute pair of overalls over a cropped t-shirt, and Uraraka had settled on a patterned button-down tucked into a pair of high-waisted shorts. "You two look cute," Izuku chimed, smiling at his friends as they got closer. Tsu and Uraraka grinned at him. "You look good too. I was a little afraid you were going to show up in basketball shorts and a hoodie, to be honest." Uraraka laughed and Izuku nervously joined in, neglecting to mention the trouble he'd had picking something out. He was glad he'd thrown the hoodie off. "So, Midoriya, Who invited you out anyways? Tsu asked as they began walking, Izuku pulling up the address on his Maps app. Oh, Kirishima, one of Bakugou's friends I met a while back. I think I told you guys about him and the others? They're all gonna be there. Uraraka groaned. Even Bakugou? Play nice, please Uraraka, Izuku said, his voice warning. It sounded like it's gonna be pretty big, so just avoid him if you don't want to see him. For my sanity, do not throw down with my roommate tonight. No promises, Uraraka said, mostly joking. The address led them to an older house on the outskirts of the downtown area and into the more residential part of the city. They could hear loud music from outside, the deep sound of the bass standing out in particular. Izuku had texted Kirishima a few minutes ago, so he was already outside leaning on the banister of the small porch, waving wildly with one hand and holding an inconspicuous red plastic cup in his other. Midoriya. You made it, he smiled, seeming genuinely excited to see him again. Izuku flashed him a grin in return and picked up his pace to greet the other. Kirishima held out his hand for what seemed to be a handshake, but immediately pulled Izuku into a hug once he'd clapped their hands together. It was brief, and immediately he moved on to introducing himself to all of Izuku's friends with an almost enviable ease. Izuku would have blamed it on the alcohol if it weren't for the fact that he knew Kirishima was just like that, confident and outgoing. He ushered all of them inside to the crowded living room. The music was still a bit muffled, coming from the basement, but it was so much louder inside. He was practically shouting when he spoke, "Let me get you all some drinks. What do you guys want? We got beer, jungle juice, soda that I can mix something if you want. I know the host so we're good on whatever. Just say the word." Izuku shrugged. Beer sounds good, he said, trying to sound as casual as Kirishima despite the fact that he'd never drank before and was definitely hyper-aware of the fact that this was illegal. This was the peer pressure his mom had warned him about, and it was working despite her best efforts. Uraraka looked at him and giggled like she could read the barely hidden anxiety on Izuku's face, but she didn't comment. Instead, she just asked Kirishima for 2 rum and cokes, ordering for Tsu as well. Todoroki passed for the time being, and Kirishima respectfully took it at face value and disappeared into the kitchen. Midoriya excused himself and followed him, unable to resist the urge to help out, considering carrying 4 cups wouldn't be the easiest task even if he were totally sober. Kirishima graciously accepted the assistance and together they mixed and poured the drinks and then returned to the small group and handed out the plastic cups. Oh man, let's go introduce the others, Midoriya. They're all psyched to see you again and meet your friends. Kirishima grabbed Izuku's arm and they all shoved their way through the small crowd to the small backyard, where Kaminari, Ashido, and Siro were all currently hanging out. Another round of introductions followed by another round of drinks. Izuku didn't particularly enjoy his beer, so he drank it down quickly to get it over with and decided to try a rum and coke this time around instead. Uraraka had never steered him wrong before, and he figured it couldn't be any worse. He was wrong. It tasted like gasoline and sugar, so he downed that one quickly too and decided to try the jungle juice, whatever the hell that was, once they headed back inside. It ended up being way better. It was just too sweet and fruity to even taste any alcohol, so he stuck with nursing that drink as they all chatted together in the living room for a while. It was all a bit of a blur, trying to keep up with the conversations going on between everyone around him, but it was also a relief. They all seemed to be getting along really well, asking each other questions about majors and where they lived and other basic icebreakers. At least, that's what Izuku gathered from the bits and pieces he heard over the music. Izuku could practically feel his nerves easing the more time went on. It spiked again when Kaminari shouted, "Something something dance." Izuku hadn't been able to make out the first part of the sentence, but context clues told him it must have been something like, "Let's go dance," because soon they were all shuffling downstairs to the basement, where the floor had been cleared and a makeshift DJ station had been set up to imitate a club. If the living room had been a crowd, the group downstairs was a mob. It was chaotic, the floor was sticky, the lights were bright and colorful and flashing in the dark, and it was so loud that Izuku wasn't sure he could hear himself think. Talk about sensory overload. They managed to squeeze into the outskirts of the dance floor, which normally would have sent Izuku into a near-panic attack a la his high school prom, But for some reason he didn't quite feel as nervous. Actually, he had fun. He saw one guy who looked so drunk that he was just swaying on his feet, eyes closed and arms in the air, and he figured he could never look that bad, so by comparison he was sure he looked fine. It was about an hour later that he had to run upstairs to hunt down and use the bathroom, ears ringing and head spinning just a little as he gripped the edges of the sink and splashed water on his face, both to ease the creeping warmth from so much exercise and close contact and to clear his foggy mind a bit. He took his now empty cup back to the kitchen, intent on trying beer again, but as he was pouring the can into his cup, someone called his name and startled him. Deku! He jumped a bit and his unsteady hand accidentally began pouring beer onto the countertop instead of its intended destination. He cursed and set the can down, picking up his cup and moving it away from the mess. Sheet, he muttered, looking over his shoulder to see who it was, even though he knew there was only one person who called him that. Bakugou had already grabbed the roll of paper towels on top of the fridge and tossed it towards Izuku, who reflexively caught it, even in his startled and tipsy state. What are you doing here? Izuku unrolled a swathe of paper towels and began mopping up the beer as best he could. Bakugou approached him and reached over his shoulder to grab one of the cans of beer for himself. He cracked it open, not bothering to grab a plastic cup. Kirishima invited me, Izuku spoke before his brain caught up with his words, then paused. Wait. No, he didn't. Kirishima didn't invite me. I just stumbled in on my own. Randomly. Yeah, I'm crashing this party, that's it. Bullshit. I'll have to kill him, Bakugou grunted, taking a swig from the can. Where the hell is he, anyways? I haven't seen anyone yet. We're dancing. Izuku interrupted, excitedly looking at his roommate. You should come dance with us downstairs. Bakugou stared for a moment and then took a long drink. How many have you had, Deku? 0.3. A rum and coke, a beer, and jungle juice. And now, Izuku looked sadly at his cup, which was only 3/4 full. Beer again. Bakugou made a face at him, sticking his tongue out in disgust. You're not supposed to mix liquor and beer, you know that, right? What's the difference? Bakugou almost looked concerned for a moment, then seemed to shrug it off. Anyways, come dance with us. No, he said, bluntly, turning away as though he was going to head back into the living room. Izuku caught his shoulder without thinking, and Bakugou turned to him. Izuku had been expecting anger, but he got confusion instead. Do you just want to hang out up here, then? Izuku asked, unsure of what he was really saying. It didn't really matter to him what Bakugou did, but Izuku also knew all their friends were downstairs dancing too. The idea of Bakugou brooding upstairs and drinking alone was kind of depressing. Bakugou shook Izuku's hand from his shoulder with a huff. I don't care what you do, he said, taking off towards the living room as Izuku had suspected. He plopped himself down on the couch. Izuku followed and sat next to him, despite his harsh words. He pulled his legs up onto the couch, and now that he was sitting still the room felt a bit titled. He sipped at the cup in his hands, the taste of the beer more tolerable now for some reason. The hell are you smiling at? Izuku blinked, not realizing he'd been smiling. He shook his head. Nothing. We haven't really talked much even though we're roommates is all. I just realized I don't even know your major, Kaken. Bakugou took a moment to think, as though deciding whether he wanted to deal with Izuku or go find his friends and be forced to dance with them. He settled on choosing Izuku as the lesser of two evils at the moment. Chemical engineering. Whoa. Really? Why are you so surprised? That's like a lot is all. Credit intensive, I bet. Of course it is, but I can fucking handle it, so don't you dare sound worried. Gonna get the best grades out of any of these other losers. What about you, anyways? Huh. Izuku took a moment to realize what Bakugou was asking, but answered excitedly, oh, I'm pre-med, hopefully studying to be a pediatrician. That's the, ultimate goal anyways. Oh, that explains why you're in some of my classes. Izuku didn't say anything for a long moment, looking at Bakugou in amazement. I am. Bakugou, in turn, furrowed his brows and tilted his head, disbelief coloring his voice. You hadn't noticed? We're in the same biology and chemistry 101 courses, you fing idiot. This was news to Izuku, and they'd been in classes for around a month by now. He'd never noticed Bakugou at all during the lectures. Granted, the classes held around 150 people since they were general education, but still. He screwed up his face, gears turning in his brain as he tried to access the memories he had of the lecture halls. Do you sit in the back? I sit in the front. Oh. Izuku felt a bit bad. How could he not have noticed his roommate? He usually sat near the middle seats, so they must have been sitting on different sides at least. You're always sitting with round face, Bakugou noted. Uraraka, you mean? No, I said and meant round face. Don't you dare fucking correct me. Izuku rolled his eyes and sunk back into the couch, drinking down a few gulps of his beer. Geez, I can't believe I didn't notice you were in those lectures. Can't believe you never said anything either. You should join me and Uraraka when we study next time. Exam next week. Let's all get together before it to study. Bakugou traced his thumb on the edge of the beer can in his hands, looking unusually thoughtful for a moment, the features on his face softer than normal now that they weren't crinkled up with anger. He glanced up at Izuku to say something, but seemed to freeze when their eyes met, and he noticed that the other had been staring at him. The softness was short-lived as Bakugou creased his brows together and frowned, returning to his default grumpy state. Stop fucking staring at me, Christ. Izuku spoke without thinking again. You should smile more. Neither of them had been expecting him to say that. What? Izuku rolled with it, despite a smarter part of his brain sending off alarms and telling him this was a dumb thing to say, that Bakugou was surely going to punch him. You used to smile a lot when we were kids, you know? Sure, it was usually when you were being smug about one thing or another, but it suit you better than this face. Izuku pointed to his own face and did his best impression of Bakugou, frowning deeply and narrowing his eyes like he was angry. Bakugou chugged the rest of his drink and crushed the poor can in his hand, the tin crumpling under his fingers with ease. He stood up and hurried back into the kitchen. Izuku waited patiently on the couch, but when Bakugou emerged again, fresh drink in hand, he made a beeline for the door to the basement. Izuku scrambled to his feet and quickly pushed his way past a few partygoers, not wanting to be left alone upstairs. Kaken, where are you going? He called. Bakugou tossed his head back to look over his shoulder at Izuku. To dance, apparently. The alternative social interaction of talking to Izuku had evidently lost its appeal as the lesser of two evils. How they all ended up in the backyard again, Izuku had no idea. After he'd downed his fourth drink and followed Kaken back to the dance floor, things got a bit blurry. He'd nearly fallen down the stairs on his way down, and Bakugou gently suggested that he stop drinking after that. Okay, so he'd phrased it like, if I see you with another drink, I'm gonna leave your sorry, passed out but wherever it falls to drown in your own vomit. It was one way of showing concern, Izuku figured. Anyways, he'd taken Bakugou's advice as the more experienced drinker and started sipping from a water bottle instead. An hour or so later, laying with his friends on the damp grass outside of the house and away from the dizzying crowds, he felt much more clear-headed. They were all chatting about this and that, but Izuku wasn't exactly paying attention. Now that he was starting to sober up, he felt very tired. He let out a yawn and stretched his arms out in front of him, up towards the dark sky. Midoriya! Ashido gasped, suddenly, her voice cutting through the clear, warm night air. Izuku opened his half-lidded eyes and propped himself up quickly, surprised at the sudden call of his. In a flurry of motion, Ashido was at his side, kneeling next to him and grabbing at his arm. She was also maybe a bit tipsy, which only half explained her behavior. Izuku was about to ask what she was doing, when she started to turn his arm. She gasped again when her eyes fell on his soul mark. You JRK? You never told us that you've met your soulmate. I want to hear every single detail. She exclaimed, her face bright and flushed with excitement. He felt his throat go dry for a moment, chest hurting with an old, familiar pang. She looked so expectant. Behind her, Uraraka, Tsu, and Todoroki all exchanged looks. The others seemed to pick up on the atmosphere too, going quiet and suddenly paying close attention to Izuku and Ashido. Ashido looked back at them when the sudden hush fell, and then turned to Izuku again, her smile fading. She loosened her grip on Izuku's arm. Oh, Midoriya, I didn't mean to, I shouldn't have asked something so personal, you don't dash, she started, her eyes widening as she realized what she'd done. It wasn't typically socially acceptable to talk about other people's soul marks if you weren't close to them, though their generation seemed to be the more relaxed about it than their parents. Izuku swallowed thickly and shook his head, knowing it had been an innocent mistake. It's okay really. I don't mind. Izuku took a deep breath and kept talking before he could back out. It was better to just explain it, right? His story wasn't complex and emotional like Todoroki's. It was very simple, really. Straightforward. My timer was at 0 when it appeared. I mean, I don't really remember that far back, but that's what my mom tells me. There's baby pictures too, I guess. Izuku shrugged, trying to keep the discussion light. He could see the shift in Ishido's face. It was pity, undoubtedly. He'd seen it in some capacity on the faces of everyone he'd told before. She opened her mouth to say something, to apologize again, but Izuku held up his hand. Don't, he said, voice soft but firm. He didn't want an apology. She hadn't done anything wrong, no one had. It wasn't something that was anyone's fault, it just was. It's okay, I came to terms with it a long time ago. It's actually fairly common, you know. Most studies place it at about 1 in 5,000 people who aren't born with working soul marks. What Ishido did next was a very different reaction than the usual. She dropped Izuku's arm and twisted around, tugging at the strap of her tank top and pushing it down her shoulder, where her own soul mark was on display atop her shoulder. It was counting down steadily, but the string of numbers was almost absurdly long. 7952:09:33. My soul mark is so long, she whined, fixing her tank top straps once Izuku had a chance to see it. It's like 9 years away, basically. I have to wait forever to meet my soulmate. I'm not trying to, compare struggles or whatever, and I'd be lying if I said I'm not excited for the day to come eventually, but waiting is the absolute worst. There's gotta be something kind of nice about being free from that, right? She was clearly trying to cheer him up, and Izuku couldn't help but smile. It was a lot more complicated than that, but she was right in some capacity. Surprisingly, Bakugou was the one who spoke up next. He was sitting in a broken plastic lawn chair next to Kirishima, avoiding eye contact by picking at some fraying plastic on the armrest. Yeah, you don't have some cosmic force trying to shove a weird destiny down your fucking throat, at least, he mused, the vitriol in his voice strong in a way that Izuku hadn't heard before. It shocked him to the point that he almost missed the vicious irony of what Bakugou was saying. Izuku wasn't one to usually feel bitter, but there was a righteous fury that flared in his chest with the way Bakugou spoke. He wanted to ask Bakugou what right he thought he had to comment on his soul mark at all at this point, but Uraraka beat him to it, as though she were reading his mind. She scoffed. Like you have any right to say that to Midoriya, of all people. Izuku's anger flipped to mild panic at Uraraka's words. She was not supposed to tell Bakugou that she knew about their past. Bakugou snapped his attention to her immediately, eyes wide. What the hell do you dash? He started to talk, but Kaminari spoke up and drowned him out, seemingly oblivious to their side conversation. He might have just sensed that a fight was about to break out, though, and wanted to change the topic. Either way, Izuku was grateful when everyone turned their attention to him instead. I mean, Bakugou has a point in his weird way. Don't you guys ever worry about the universe screwing it up? Just because people are soulmates doesn't mean it always works out. I'm so terrified. What if I don't like them? Or they don't like me? From the corner of his eye Izuku saw Tsu hold tighter to Uraraka's hand as she chimed in. My parents got divorced when I was little, and they were soulmates. Soul mark or not, it doesn't matter if you don't work on it that some people end up taking their partners for granted because they think they're entitled to them, you know. Siro, who was also laying on his back and staring at the sky, grimaced. Yeah, but can you imagine not having soulmates? And it was just one big dating free-for-all. Kirishima swiftly kicked him and nodded towards Izuku to remind him of how this whole conversation had started. Siro backpedaled. I mean, not that it can't happen that way, of course. It's just, really different from how I think about the world, is all. Sorry, Midoriya. Izuku shook his head, letting out a genuinely relieved laugh, any anger and nervousness fading slowly the more they all opened up. It was nice, in a way, to know everyone had their own unique relationships with their soul marks, whether they were still ticking down or sat at zero. When he was little it had all seemed so romanticized, so black and white. People without soul marks were unlovable monsters and people with soul marks were ultimately destined to live fulfilling lives with perfect partners. Obviously, that wasn't the reality. People were still just people no matter what, capable of great love and great cruelty. It's okay really. Soulmates are cool I guess, but I probably wouldn't even have the time to deal with a relationship for the next 8 years or so between school and residency. At least I don't have to stress about meeting some mysterious stranger on top of trying to pass all my classes. Ciro looked at his elbow and sighed. I calculated mine a while ago and I'm going to meet my soulmate next year during finals PRD. Can you imagine a worse time to try and deal with that? The conversation turned from then, taking on a lighter note and avoiding the deeper nuances of navigating soul marks. Izuku was glad, noticing that Todoroki was able to relax better now as well. You heading back to the dorm, Deku? Bakugou asked, noticing that Izuku had gone back to the living room with Uraraka, Tsu and Todoroki. He'd followed them through the kitchen from the backyard, tossing his empty drink into the recycling bin as he went. Izuku turned to him and nodded, a bit lightheaded but feeling entirely sober by now. Yeah, it's already 2 a.m. I'm exhausted, he laughed and after a beat, spoke up again, are you gonna come with us? Bakugou gave a grunt of agreement. Someone's gotta make sure you get your sloppy but home, don't they? Todoroki, who as far as Izuku knew hadn't had anything at all to drink, raised his eyebrows at Bakugou. You know I live in the same dorm as both of you, right? We met earlier? It's not like Izuku's going home alone. Bakugou frowned. Who the hell are you? Todoroki rolled his eyes, figuring Bakugou was just trying to push his buttons, considering he hadn't drank enough to completely forget their earlier transaction. Izuku, however, knew this was just Bakugou's prideful way of not having to walk home alone himself, especially considering Izuku was far from sloppy at this point. You can walk with us, Kaken, he smiled at his roommate. It was probably just the lighting, but he could have sworn he saw a blush rise to Bakugou's cheeks at the embarrassment of being called out. Shut up, Bakugou said, pushing the front door open and deciding to wait for them out in the front lawn. Izuku waved and shouted a final goodbye to the others, who'd hung back in the kitchen to make their last drinks. Then he followed Bakugou out the front door and they all started down the sidewalk. It was fairly empty on this side of town, the sudden quiet resonating between them all. No one wanted to break it by talking until they got closer to the downtown area and the noise of nearby bars picked up, comforting them with familiarity. They stopped briefly at a food stand that was still open outside of a bar. It was busy, but Uraraka complained enough about her hunger until they all agreed to stop and get some food, leaving the crowded stand with imigawayaki and taiyaki. It was rare for street food to be open this late, but the young man running it seemed to be catching all of the stray drunkards in his net with ease, so it must have been a solid business plan. Hey, Uraraka, maybe you should open a late-night street food stand if you really want to make some cash. That guy looked like he was making tonight what most people make over a week. Don't tempt me with those kinds of ideas, Midoriya, or I'll drop out of school, she laughed, in a much better mood now that she had warm food in her hands. They're really good, too, Izuku agreed, taking another bite of his taiyaki. He looked over at Bakugou. You really should have gotten something, Kaken. Do you want a bite? He held out his hand, but the other promptly pushed it away, refusing the offer. I don't want your shitty food, the custard ones are always too damn sweet. Izuku shrugged, more for himself than. They all fell quiet again, but this time because they were preoccupied with eating. It wasn't long after that they parted ways with Tsu and Uraraka, and then eventually Todoroki as well. Izuku wished him a good night as the elevator stopped on his floor of the building. Izuku had been tired before, but now that he was full of food and so close to his bed, he felt ready to pass out by the time he and Bakugou returned to their room. They both changed into their sleep clothes, backs turned to each other, and then brushed their teeth in the communal bathroom before getting into their respective beds, too tired to stand up any longer. Izuku rolled onto his stomach, feeling a little gross and sweaty, but he definitely wasn't going to shower tonight. Something else had been bothering him since their earlier conversation about soul marks. It nagged at him, keeping his eyes open even as he rested his cheek against the pillow and wanted desperately to just sleep. "Hey, Kaken," he said quietly. Tentatively. He heard a groan on the other side of the pitch-black room. "How long now till your soul mark times out anyways?" He didn't get a reply, and assumed Bakugou had passed out finally. He turned to his side, but just as he closed his eyes Bakugou replied, his voice soft and tired. "About 2 years still." Izuku figured that sounded right. It had been so long since they'd talked about soul marks and even longer since Bakugou had mentioned his own. Izuku might have pursued his line of questioning, but he was too exhausted, and his body surrendered to sleep before he could even think of anything else to ask. Izuku tapped at the phone sitting on the desk in front of him, scrolling through various social media accounts. He'd arrived a good 15 minutes early to his lecture, which wasn't unusual in a class this size. If you wanted your seat, you had to make sure you got there in time to claim it. His phone buzzed against the hardwood, rattling a bit noisily. He glanced up at the notification drop-down on the screen. "Kaken, hey nerd. Kaken, look up from your FANG phone." Izuku's eyes widened slightly, but he did as instructed and looked up. Bakugou was sitting a few levels down, turned around in his chair and promptly giving Izuku the middle finger. He was smiling though, well, he was smirking. Izuku couldn't help but bite his bottom lip and laugh, not offended in the slightest. He was far too used to Bakugou's way of communicating to be hurt by something so small. "Hey Kaken." Izuku quickly grabbed his backpack and moved down to the second row where Bakugou was sitting. He took the seat next to Bakugou and then plopped his backpack down in the seat next to himself with the intent of saving it for Uraraka whenever she arrived. "You know, Deku, that wasn't exactly an invitation. Usually when I flip people off it has the exact opposite effect." Bakugou mused, his smile replaced with his usual grumpy look. He didn't sound very grumpy. Izuku flashed him a grin. "Yeah, but you have to know that I'm not like most people by now." "You're right, I never could shake you that easily." Izuku pulled his phone out again and shot Uraraka a short text to warn her that he wasn't in the usual spot, and to warn her that Bakugou was here too. She'd warmed up to Bakugou ever so slightly after spending the night at the party with him around. It gave her a chance to reconcile the stories Izuku had told with the fact that Bakugou was more than that and had, undoubtedly, matured since then. He was still kind of rough around the edges, but Izuku had a feeling that wasn't ever going to go away. He would probably have a heart attack if there came a day that Bakugou was outwardly and unabashedly nice to him. He had to specify outwardly and unabashedly, because Bakugou was nice to him, in his very unique way. Nice may have been too strong of a term, but for Bakugou's standards it seemed fitting. For instance, Bakugou was never going to directly invite Izuku to sit with him in class. He'd fight tooth and nail to deny he'd done so entirely. His social interactions all had their own code, and Izuku felt like he was slowly putting together a solution for it. Izuku knew that he'd always been this way, even when Bakugou had been at his worst with him. He'd always sensed he was missing something, some piece of the puzzle that just never clicked into place. He'd moved before he'd ever gotten a chance to fully solve it, and now the pieces had all shifted. Izuku really enjoyed puzzles. Having another chance to figure Bakugou out was proving to be kind of fun in some ways. "So, you go to the gym this morning?" Izuku asked, but his phone buzzed in his hands again to signal Uraraka had replied. He looked down at it and started reading, immediately distracted. Uraraka, laughing face. "Oh, I forgot to tell you. One of Tsu's frogs isn't feeling well, so I'm skipping to help her take him to the vet." "She's really worried," sad face. Midoriya. "You're not making up some elaborate lie to get out of seeing Kaken, right?" Uraraka, laughing face. "I would never joke about green beans being sick." "How dare you? Take notes for me though, please Anix." Midoriya, "K. Hope green beans is okay." Izuku frowned a bit at his phone. Tsu had a bit of an odd hobby of raising frogs, and it had carried over to college once she'd learned she'd be living in a single. They were easy enough pets to hide from the prying eyes of an RA. Her and Uraraka had ended up in the same building, but there wasn't really a way to choose your roommate with the lottery-like system the school had in place. It didn't really bother either of them, since they'd decided a while ago to take their relationship slowly. They'd met senior year back in high school when their soul marks ran down at the same time, but Sue was hesitant given her parents' soulmate situation, so they didn't want to rush into anything. And in the meantime, Sue raised frogs and let Uraraka name some of them. Hence, green beans. Are you even listening to me, Deku? You asked me a goddamn question and then ignore me? Izuku looked up from his phone to Bakugou, who was glaring at him. Izuku had totally gotten lost in thought. The hell are you even thinking about with that zoned-out look on your face, Space Cadet? Bakugou asked, slouching over the desk in front of them and resting his head on his hand, eyes narrowed and intent. Izuku noted that particular nickname was a new one. Frogs? Bakugou didn't say anything for a long moment before he sighed and decided to pull his laptop out. Forget I asked, geez. Don't know why I even fucking try with you, sometimes. He sounded exasperated, but Izuku just shrugged it off and grabbed his own laptop from his bag to set it up as well. Class was going to start in a few minutes and the seats around them had quickly started filling up. Not to be rude, Izuku moved his backpack from what was supposed to be Uraraka's seat, and in a few minutes it was taken by stranger. Izuku was a meticulous note-taker. He had a separate Word document for each lecture that was outlined and color-coded. Everything was written in shorthand during the class, but he always went back and filled the notes out with proper grammar later on to make studying easier. It was probably the reason Uraraka felt okay trusting him to fill her in on what she'd missed. Bakugou, however, was much more chaotic. He seemed to boot up one long, running document just labeled Chemistry 103. It was messy, but it definitely looked thorough. Not great for sharing with other people, but Izuku figured there must have been a method to the madness if Bakugou was to be believed about his grades. And Izuku had no reason to doubt him about that. He'd consistently been at the top of their classes back in middle school. The contrast between his clean freak side back at the dorm and his totally relaxed, almost messy learning style was fascinating. They both fell silent as their professor, Dr. Kiyama, took to the podium and smacked her hands against the wood loudly to call everyone to attention. She was a fairly excitable woman and had a way of cracking jokes that kept everyone interested or, at least, awake for the lecture. It ended early at 45 minutes with the professor assigning them a surprise round of online, open-book quizzes. She added a mandatory reading when everyone groaned about the assignment, refusing to sympathize with the plight of the poor college students. It was like she enjoyed seeing them suffer or something. Izuku couldn't help but feel annoyed at his fellow classmates for their complaints, but he jotted the extra assignments down in his agenda nonetheless and packed up his things. This was his last lecture for the day and thus had plenty of time to get his notes to Uraraka and maybe get a head start on the assignment. He normally just went to the library with her after this class, but he figured he'd walk back with Bakugou to the dorms today, instead. Once they were outside, Izuku couldn't help but glance at the sky with a worried look on his face as they walked down the sidewalk. The sky had seemed to darken significantly in the hour he'd been inside. He frowned. Do you know if it's supposed to rain today? Bakugou, with his bag hanging on one shoulder, shrugged. No idea. I didn't check the reports this morning. It's just I didn't bring an umbrella and this jacket doesn't have a hood dash. And with perfect timing, a drop of rain fell right on Izuku's nose. You just had to jinx it, didn't you? Bakugou groaned. It was evident from his tone of voice that he also hadn't prepared at all for the rain either. It's okay, we're only a 10-minute walk from the dorms, I'm sure it'll hold off until we get back. There was a loud crack of thunder, and the rain picked up. They both had the same idea and ran for cover under the awning of a nearby shop. It didn't offer much in the way of shelter, but it was better than nothing. Quietly, they both watched as the shower turned to a harsh downpour, water splashing at their feet. Bakugou sent Izuku a look. I hate you so much. It's not like I control the weather. Izuku shouted, defensively. He turned around and read the name of the store in the window front. It was a small used bookstore. The sign on the door said they were open. Izuku tugged at Bakugou's sleeve and nodded towards the front door. Hey, let's go inside and wait this out, yeah? Whatever, Bakugou said, and lightning flashed in the sky above them. He sighed and nodded, realizing that it was the best option. Better than getting drenched by wind-whipped rain, anyways. He tore his sleeve from Izuku's grasp and led the way inside the small, rustic-looking store. A bell chimed as they entered, and a bored-looking girl at the counter with heavy eye makeup and dark clothes jumped slightly when she heard the noise. She scrambled to grab her phone and checked it, before cursing softly and saying, "No, still too early." She had an earbud in one ear and was seated on a stool, book open in front of her. She seemed bored, but not relaxed in the slightest. Izuku smiled at her, regardless. "Hey there. I hope you don't mind, we really just wanted to get away from the storm. But feel free to look around, anyways," she hummed, turning her attention back to her book. Izuku briefly wondered if she was a student like them. A lot of people in this area who were around their age were university students, but it was a big city and thus it was hard to make snap judgments. The two of them started wandering around, keeping an eye on the front windows to watch and see how the rain developed. Izuku pretended to be interested in some of the non-fiction books as he made his way casually to the back, where he'd spotted the section for comics and graphic novels. He actually did enjoy reading in pretty much all forms, even textbooks to an extent, but he had a soft spot for comics. He and Bakugou had both grown up with them, so it was hard not to find them appealing. Bakugou was giving a copy of some fantasy novel a disinterested once-over and Izuku was flipping through a vintage comic he'd found when they both heard the bell above the door chime again. Izuku looked up briefly from the book in his hand. A woman a few years older than them walked in, her dark hair done up in a messy updo. It looked like it had been neat and proper at one point, but she'd gotten stuck in the rainstorm as well and it currently looked just a bit unruly. Her outfit was nice, but had also been an unfortunate victim of the rainstorm. She also looked like she was about to cry, which caught Izuku's attention more than anything else. He almost wanted to ask her if something was wrong, but she spoke up first. Do you sell umbrellas here? I'm going to be late, please dash." She paused and tugged at her shirt a bit, seeming to look down at her own chest. Her eyes widened and she looked back out at the sidewalk, panic evident in her voice. "Oh no, I think I missed it. Oh, God. What do you even do in a situation like this?" She turned back to the lady at the front desk, who was staring at her, slack-jawed but silent. The soaked woman kept talking. "Did anyone come in here recently?" She suddenly seemed to notice Izuku and Bakugou in the back. She blinked at them, then at the employee. The woman behind the counter didn't say a word. She slowly turned her head and brushed her hair away from her neck to uncover the soul mark behind her ear. It was at 0. The realization of what was happening hit Izuku instantly. He was watching someone meet their soulmate for the first time. He'd never seen this happen before. Uraraka had met Sue when she transferred into their high school, in a class that Izuku wasn't a part of. The stories he'd heard about it were the closest he'd ever come to witnessing a meeting, but it wasn't anything like seeing it happen real-time. The woman who had come in from the rainstorm seemed to grasp what was happening as well. She covered her mouth, a smile hiding behind it. This time, when she spoke, her panic had turned completely to joy. "So I didn't miss it. It went just as planned after all." The employee jumped over the counter with ease, her own smile soft. "The name's Jairu. Momo Yayarosa. But please, just call me Momo." She giggled, holding out her hand in a greeting. "I'm sorry I barged through the door in such a huff. And I look so dreadful too," she suddenly said, looking down at herself. She may have been soaked, but she still looked fairly nice, if not a bit fancy, Izuku thought. She'd clearly dressed up for this moment, for this precise second that she'd probably been waiting for her entire life. He couldn't blame her, not that he ever had to worry about it, but he was sure if he had a soulmate he'd want to make the best first impression possible as well. That thought shook Izuku from the moment. Everything felt wrong all of the sudden. He and Bakugou were invading on something terribly private just by being in the same space, he felt. Not that the two women, Jairu and Momo, seemed to care very much. They were a bit lost in their own world, understandably. Izuku put down the comic book in a hurry, and glanced at Bakugou, who was already looking at him. The glance they exchanged was a bit awkward, but Bakugou subtly tilted his head towards the door and Izuku nodded in agreement. Quietly, they slipped past the two new soulmates and out onto the sidewalk again. The rain hadn't totally let up, but it was more of a bearable drizzle by this point. The mood between them was weird after that. Soulmates weren't exactly a comfortable topic for either of them, and Izuku couldn't help the small tinge of jealousy eating at his stomach. He could only imagine what it must have felt like to have a perfect stranger walk into your life out of nowhere and change it forever, for better or for worse. To know without a doubt that other person was the one. Even a meeting as casual and mundane as theirs, a woman taking shelter from the rain in a lonely bookstore, became a romantic spectacle. It wasn't lovely in spite of its monotony, but because of it. And it was too lovely to be ruined by Izuku's own resentment. Izuku tightened his fist around the strap of his backpack. Nowadays, it was more rare for him to feel this kind of sting, like he'd told Ishido at the party. He'd come to terms with it years ago. He knew it wasn't a loveless death sentence. Feeling this way wouldn't change that he'd been born without a soul mark. He was staring intently at the sidewalk under his feet, trying to rein back his emotions, trying to remember. He was thrown from his spiraling thoughts when he felt a sharp pain on the side of his head as Bakugou flicked him. Earth to Space Cadet. You hungry? Izuku gave a start and snapped his attention to the blonde walking next to him, realizing now that the other's hand was still posed at his temple, middle finger tucked under his thumb in what was clearly a threat to flick him again. Izuku frowned and tilted his head away from Bakugou's hand. Without getting an answer, Bakugou stopped at the next storefront and held open the door for Izuku in an oddly polite moment. Izuku was suspicious, wondering if he was going to let the door slam into him as he walked in or something, but his own polite and trusting side forced him to go inside anyways. He was relieved when Bakugou simply followed him inside what appeared to be a convenience store. Kaminari works here part-time. Don't know if he's in today, but that's how I know it's here, Bakugou said, as an explanation for why he'd chosen this place. He moved to the cold food case without a second thought and grabbed 2 onaja, the spicy tuna, and a small carton of milk tea. Izuku took the hint and picked out his own typical convenience store meal of an egg sandwich, an All Might branded raspberry soda, and a pre-packaged serving of Castella. Bakugou looked down at the meal he'd gathered in his hands, clearly judging him. I can't believe you still eat the same shit you did when we were 5. What is all that garbage? We're not toddlers anymore, Deku. Deku looked down at his chosen meal and laughed. It was true that he hadn't really changed up his convenience store food preferences in years. Is it the superhero soda that puts it over the edge? You still like that fucking nonsense a lot, huh? Deku scoffed, as if you didn't used to be as obsessed as me. You're just jealous of my collector's edition poster, signed by Toshinori himself. I've seen you eyeing it back in our room. Well, you can't have it. I waited in line for 5 hours to meet him and dash. Like I want your dumb poster. Bakugou nuffed, leaving Izuku behind in favor of approaching the checkout counter. Izuku followed, a small feeling of victory bubbling in his chest as he laughed. You still think it's cool too, don't you? Izuku teased. Besides, you literally own All Might boxer briefs. I've seen them. Don't try to lie to me. Instantly, Bakugou's cheeks went red with embarrassment. Off, how would you even know that? We're roommates? You fold your laundry in our room all the time? It's not like I went out of my way to learn that fact about you, Kaken. Izuku rolled his eyes. Bakugou pointedly ignored his comment and put his food down on the counter and motioned for Izuku to put his stuff down too. The petite teenage girl behind the counter greeted them both pleasantly with a small hello and began ringing them up. It didn't seem like Kaminari was working this afternoon, after all. Come on, loser, I have a card here. Put your sheet down on the counter so I can pay. What? Izuku asked incredulously. He eyed the blonde with suspicion, holding on tight to his food defensively. Why would you want to pay for my food? At the question, Bakugou bristled, hand tightening around his card. He pointedly looked away from Izuku. He clearly hadn't been expecting any kind of backtalk to his kind offer. Does it matter? I said I have a FING card here. I get points and a discount, or whatever. Just put your sheet down on the counter already. Izuku stared for a moment, then hesitantly handed the girl behind the counter his items. She seemed grateful to relieve the tense atmosphere and scanned each item quickly before either of them could change their mind. Bakugou paid, and then shoved the plastic bag with Izuku's food into his chest as they made their way back out of the building. Izuku held the bag to his chest, trying to process what had just happened. He couldn't help but smile. Bakugou really had changed a lot since middle school, no matter how hard he tried not to show it. Happily, Izuku dug into the bag and pulled out his sandwich. They both ate as they walked back to the dorms, the rain having let up significantly in the time they'd spent shopping. "You feel better?" Bakugou asked between bites of his onigiri. "Feel better? Is there a fucking echo in here or what?" I guess so. Thanks, by the way." He supposed he did feel better. He'd completely forgotten about the incident back in the bookstore until just now, which Izuku suddenly understood was exactly what Bakugou was talking about. He'd intended on getting him distracted, and it had worked, even if he'd been a bit crass through the whole process. Izuku grinned down at the sandwich in his hand. Maybe Bakugou wasn't as much of a mystery as he thought. Maybe he was just another kid that had F'd up in the past and was just trying to make things right, in his own way. Maybe being his roommate wouldn't be so miserable after all. "Don't mention it, nerd. Like, ever again. You two need to keep up better," Ida called, turned around on the sidewalk and jogging in place as he waited for Kirishima and Izuku to catch up to him. The three of them were on an evening run, with Kirishima and Izuku looking much more exhausted than their taller friend. Izuku, in particular, felt like he was dying. He'd been slacking on his workouts all summer since graduation, and it was all catching up to him now. A little while after Kirishima had started texting him, the two started talking about running together, and naturally Izuku felt it would be good motivation to invite his former track team captain, Ida, along with them. He'd forgotten just how much of a hard-ass he was, though, in his brief time off. "Midoriya, I'm disappointed in you. How long has it been since your last run?" Ida began moving again the moment they caught up to him, giving no room for a break. Izuku groaned. "About," he huffed, "I think." He was struggling to talk. "Two, deep inhale, months, shallow exhale. No wonder you've lost all of your stamina. Unacceptable. We'll just have to make our run twice as long to start making up for lost time." Kirishima shot Izuku one hell of a look. He was faring better since he'd been on a regular workout schedule, but anyone would have felt miserable with that news. "Man, your friend is kinda crazy, huh?" "I can hear you, Kirishima," Ida called back, throwing them both a stern look over his shoulder. "Sorry dude, but you're kinda crazy. I like it though." Kirishima gave a brief laugh, grinning as they jogged along the blacktop path. A couple people in bikes whizzed past them. "Gets me pumped. Such a manly spirit." Izuku was surrounded by masochistic freaks. Izuku gulped for air, "to die." "Sorry Midoriya, not an option. Still have 2 miles left." Ida shot back, and Izuku felt a part of himself go numb at the thought. It was a grueling 45 minutes before they all stopped near a park bench and Izuku collapsed onto it, downing what was left of his water before putting his head between his knees. He had definitely pushed himself too hard. Well, he hadn't exactly been the one who pushed himself, Ida had. "Midoriya, you need to stretch or your muscles will be stiff later," Ida said, already grabbing his ankle behind himself to stretch the front muscles of his thighs. Kirishima ignored the advice as well and took a seat next to Izuku instead, pouring some of his water over his head, his normally spiked-up hair sagging as he drenched it. "Give us 5 men. I feel like I'm back in Hell Week," Kirishima groaned, patting Izuku encouragingly on his back. Izuku kept his head down for another minute before he sat up straight, still feeling a bit woozy and out of breath. Ida leaned over to touch his toes now. "Don't worry, you'll both build up your stamina quickly. I know for a fact that you used to do this kind of run with ease, Midoriya, so I won't be hearing any excuses from you until you're back up to snuff." Izuku made a low noise of discontent, already missing his lazy days of laying on his bed rewatching superhero movies and munching on junk food. He'd made a terrible, unforgivable mistake by inviting Ida on their run, because he'd never hear the end of it now. He'd doomed himself. "And Kirishima, you did very well today. I think you just need to work on speed, but your stamina is already well developed." At the praise, Kirishima's face lit up. He flashed Ida a toothy grin, his mood wildly changing. "Thanks man. You're like some kind of machine though. I don't know if I'll ever be able to keep up with you, dude." "Well, Then you have a goal, don't you? Ida smiled gently in return. He had a way with encouraging others. He was disciplined and unrelenting, sure, but he definitely made people want to better themselves. Izuku supposed that was why he'd been their captain come senior year. Finally, Izuku felt his breathing even out and he leaned back against the back of the park bench, letting out a heavy sigh. He tugged his sweaty tank top from his chest in disgust, sticking his tongue out. I need the longest shower of my life, I think. You and me both, bro. Kirishima agreed and stood up. I'd say we should go get dinner. Somewhere, but I don't even think the school cafeteria would let us in. He laughed, and Izuku resigned himself to standing up as well, his legs protesting the movement. Everything felt so sore. I'm gonna just head back to my dorm and crash, he sighed. Kirishima and Ida nodded in agreement. Right, well, my home is this way. Ida pointed behind himself, knowing that at the very least, Izuku lived in the opposite direction. Kirishima nodded. I think Izuku and I need to head the other way. It was nice meeting you, man. I'm already hyped for next time. He held out his fist, and Ida awkwardly met it with a gentle fist bump. Kirishima accepted that as their parting and Izuku managed to muster up a goodbye as well. The walk back home wasn't going to be too long. They'd kept their run restricted to a roughly mile loop around a park near campus. It was paved and even, and the 1 mile mark made it easy to keep track of how much they'd done. It was only about 10 minutes from Izuku's dormitory, and about 20 from Kirishima's. Admittedly, even though he was exhausted and sweaty, it was kind of nice to feel the dull ache of a good workout again. Now that it was over, Izuku could look back on it more fondly. Kirishima seemed genuinely happy, too, despite their previous suffering. Hey, Midoriya, can I ask you something? Izuku nodded at his friend. Yeah, sure. What's up? What happened between you and Bakugou? Well, Izuku wasn't really expecting that. Especially not with how causally Kirishima had brought it up. I'm not sure I know what you're talking about. Well, it's just remember a while back I mentioned he gets kind of weird when I mention you? Izuku absolutely recalled that conversation. He'd been thinking about it on and off for a few weeks now, since the party. It still bugged him. Oh yeah, I vaguely remember you saying that, I guess. I just can't help but wonder why. You guys grew up together, you were childhood friends. It's just odd that he never even mentioned you to any of us. Okay, that stung a little bit. Izuku had kind of figured that was the case considering how badly their friendship had ended up, but having it confirmed still didn't feel great. Izuku just shrugged a little. He didn't feel it was his place to really talk about their past. It didn't feel right without Bakugou being here, since Izuku knew the stories made him sound like a terrible guy. Kirishima and the others were certainly aware of his bad attitude, but for the most part they all just accepted him as he was, kind of an a-hole but fun to tease and be around. Generally harmless. Izuku decided to keep it vague. We were friends when we were really little, but we kind of grew up and took different paths, I guess. Drifted apart, is all. I'm sure you know how it is. It's a pretty common story. Kirishima stared at him as though he were trying to decide if Izuku was telling the whole truth or not, but he eventually took it at face value. Or at least he didn't question Izuku about it further. He just smiled. Yeah, we all have people like that. I think it's nice, though, that you two got a chance to reconnect. What a small world you ended up not only in the same college but as roommates too. You're telling me, Izuku said, I mean, I'm not really surprised we both ended up here. This was our dream school, ever since we were old enough to know we wanted to go to college. The roommate thing was a heck of a shock on move-in day though. You don't hate it though, right? Izuku sent Kirishima a confused look. It was kind of a weird question, but he shook his head slowly. What? No, I don't. He's not a bad roommate. Good, I don't think he hates you either. Izuku smiled and sighed. Well, that's a relief to hear from you of all people. You guys seem close. Bakugou didn't really have a ton of friends in middle school. I was kind of amazed to see him with everyone. That doesn't surprise me in the slightest, Kirishima laughed. He was so scary back in our freshman year. He's definitely calmed down a lot since then, even though he's still kind of well, you know how he is. Kirishima clapped his hand against Izuku's back. It's probably better that you ended up as his roommate. A lesser person would have moved out after a week. Yeah. I wouldn't necessarily say we're back to being friends yet, but it's a lot better than it used to be. Don't tell him I said any of this, though. Izuku looked to his left and stopped as they approached the front door to his dorms. Kirishima punched his shoulder playfully. You got it, man. Good workout. I'll see you later. If you ever want to do weightlifting in the gym, I go with Bakugou on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'm sure it's fine if you ever want to tag along. We go early, though I'm sure you know that already since you live with him. Izuku nodded. I usually do weightlifting with Uraraka, but I'll get back to you if I ever want to get some extra time in. See ya. He turned and scanned his student ID at the front door, granting himself access to the dormitory. The moment he made his way into his room, something was flung at his face. He didn't have time to react, so the offending object hit him square in the nose and fell to the floor. Izuku sputtered and looked down, finding it was a roll of paper towels that had hit him. Where the hell have you been, nerd? I hope you're ready to start cleaning, 'cause I already did my half of the room. Izuku felt his heart drop. He was so tired, he did not want to finish off his Sunday with cleaning. He didn't even know what needed to be cleaned right now. He dusted and vacuumed last weekend. What else could Bakugou want from him? He stared at the paper towels sadly and crouched down to pick them up, leg muscles still screaming. When he stood and looked back at his roommate to protest, he had to give pause. The other was sitting on the edge of his neatly made bed, laptop pushed aside for the moment being. He was leaning back on his palms, feet barely touching the floor. Most notably, he was grinning in amusement at the distress on Izuku's face. He gripped the roll of paper towels tightly in his hands. Bakugou looked almost happy. Izuku had grown so used to exclusively seeing scowls and glares sent his way that it was jarring to see something more genuine flash across his face. It reminded Izuku of when they were kids, before things had gone bad between them. Kaken, I think we're lost. Where did the others even end up? Izuku said, looking around. It was hard to see in the darkness of the night. The dim lights in the distance and the almost full moon only did so much to counter the late hour and the tall stalks of corn surrounding them. And whose fault is that anyways? In the distance, Izuku heard someone scream. Sure, it turned to laughter after a moment, but it still spooked him so bad that he jumped and grabbed Bakugou's shoulders instinctively. Bakugou, for his part, shook Izuku's hands off of him and rolled his eyes. Come on, Deku, it's just some shitty corn maze. Bakugou gestured to the tall dead stalks. There were some red lights set up to the left of them that were positioned to look like eyes staring eerily out of the thick vegetation. It was unsettling. None of this shit is real, idiot. Get it together. Excuse me for getting into the Halloween spirit. People worked hard on this to make it scary. The least I can do is act scared. Izuku argued, eyes darting back and forth, his body tense. It was kind of his fault they'd been separated from the others. Back at a fork in the corn maze, a man dressed as a scarecrow had jumped out of the corn, chainsaw revved, and Izuku had just grabbed the person closest to him and ran. It happened to be Bakugou, and the others had happened to run the opposite direction. Thus, the two of them were now totally on their own. Ida had been holding on to the collected pieces of the maze map, and without him, they basically had to start the hunt all over or just get very lucky and find one of the exits. Act scared, Deku? You looked like you're going to pieces your pants back there. He had a chainsaw. How was I supposed to react? Just stand there and die? It's not real, you useless idiot. That was definitely a real chainsaw. So, Bakugou barked back, looking at the one piece of the map they'd managed to collect so far. It's not like he was gonna fucking murder us for real. He was an actor. He frowned at the slip of paper, then looked back up at the intersection they'd come to a stop at. He sighed and chose to just keep moving forward. Izuku didn't question it and followed. Quietly, Izuku kicked a rock on the path into the dense corn stalks, muttering, "You don't know that. Maybe he was a real serial killer and I saved you." He wasn't a real serial killer, Deku. Bakugou's voice was deadpan, frustrated. You don't dash. Izuku cut himself off with a scream as several hands suddenly reached out from the corn, fingertips bloody and long nails clawing. A shaking voice warned them not to stray from the path, lest they also become one with the corn. Izuku jumped away from the hands and stumbled a bit before falling into a fighting stance. It took him a moment to realize nothing was coming out to attack them, it was just some actors and actresses messing with them from off the path. The hands slowly retracted, waiting for whenever their next victim came by. Man, your fight or flight signals are out of whack. You think a serial killer is coming and you go with flight, but you see some disembodied hands and try to fight. Bakugou tugged down the hood of Izuku's costume to cover his eyes, laughing at the indignant noise Izuku made. Well, I got us away from that serial killer safely, didn't I? Izuku asked, cheeks puffed out slightly as he pouted, fixing his hood and his hair. If by got us away safely, you mean you got us lost and separated from the others then? Yes, you did a great job, Deku. Look, I said I was sorry, he whined in response, genuinely starting to feel bad. It was getting late and prior to being separated from their friends, they'd already been in the maze for almost half of an hour. At this point it felt like it had been closer to an hour. Izuku confirmed it by glancing at his phone. He'd gotten a text 15 minutes ago from Uraraka, telling him to call her when they made it out. He'd texted her initially after they got lost, asking for a picture of the map, but she just told them to have fun figuring it out together. He'd tried Ida next, but apparently Uraraka had taken the map pieces hostage to keep them from cheating. Izuku knew eventually she'd give in and send them a picture if they took too long. If she was doing this as some kind of revenge against Bakugou, it was surely going to backfire and just make things worse. Their fledgling friendship was already on shaky ground. He did not need getting lost in a corn maze for 3 hours to be the thing that finally made Bakugou snap. As he was looking down at his phone, he crashed into Bakugou's back. The other had stopped short on the path for some reason. Izuku started to apologize, but Bakugou lifted a finger to his lips, glancing back at Izuku with an intense look in his eyes. Do you hear something? This put Izuku on edge immediately. What? Kakakin, I swear to God if you're messing with me right now I'll dash. No. Really, do you hear that? The two of them fell silent for a long moment. At first there was nothing and then, laughter? It was laughter, low and feminine. From the corn, a lady dressed in pure white appeared, her pale skin almost glowing in the moonlight. Her powdery dress hung to her thin frame, dark hair stark against the ethereal glow about the rest of her. Slowly and without a word, she raised a finger and pointed to the pair, and began walking towards them. By far, her slow and stilted movements were scarier than any of the other gimmicks they'd encountered that night. She was a hell of an actress. Even Bakugou's skin had gotten goosebumps and, without thinking, Izuku and him both started running again. No fight this time, just flight. Izuku figured he didn't actually want to punch one of the actors, but he sure as hell did want to get away from her creepy butt. When they started running, she picked up her pace as well. She ran like her ankle was injured, her arms still outstretched towards them. Unlike the other actors, she was persistent, and kept after them longer than what seemed necessary. Once they'd gotten some distance on her, Bakugou grabbed Izuku at the next fork in the path and shoved him into the dense stalks, following afterwards. He wanted to protest, to insist they keep running and not hide, but Bakugou clamped his hands over Izuku's face, wordlessly insisting he shut the hell up. This lady had actually managed to freak him out. It seemed, so much for his brave speech from earlier about how none of this shit was real. Izuku swallowed thickly and then nodded, the movement almost imperceptible. The corn was dense and Izuku could barely see the path from over Bakugou's shoulder. He kept his eyes trained there, though, waiting for any sign of the mysterious spectral actress. After a minute or so, they heard the low laughter again. It got closer to then, it faded into the distance. Izuku practically melted with relief. He finally chanced to look back at Bakugou, who slowly removed his hands from Izuku's mouth. The blonde let out a quiet sigh, his breath ghosting over Izuku's collar, suddenly making him aware of just how close they were. Bakugou seemed to realize this at the same time, too, now that the danger had passed. He practically jumped backwards, cheeks darkening with a blush as the stalks parted, and he stumbled backwards onto the dirt path. We should keep going. Let's get out of this dumb place, he insisted, turning away from Izuku quickly and starting off down the path, determined to not turn back around. Izuku hung back for only a moment before jogging lightly to catch up with his friend. His heart was still pounding, for some reason. Suddenly, the woman jumped out in front of them again, her arms outstretched to block the way. The two of them both screamed and turned on their heels, scrambling to run in the other direction. They took the other direction at the fork and, as they were running, Izuku spotted something. He grabbed the sleeve of Bakugou's jacket and practically pulled him down a side alley, the blonde yelling curses at him the whole time until Izuku pointed up at a sign. Kaken calmed down. It's one of the exits. They both ran towards the wooden arch, a sign hanging from it that read, "Exit," in red paint, and practically leaped past the threshold, as if the lady wouldn't be able to follow them outside of the boundaries of the maze if she had really wanted to. Bakugou pumped his fist in the air and hollered, spinning around to point back at the maze. You shitty corn maze. No one of us with the Bakugou Katsuki. He flipped the corn maze off with both his hands, out of breath from their final sprint but grinning wildly. Izuku was also panting and smiling with the adrenaline their victory had given him, but he smacked Bakugou's hands. Hey! There's kids around here, cool it? Like I care. Too late for any demon brats to be out here anyways, he said, swatting Izuku's hand away from his in turn. The lady in white appeared at the end of the path they'd just come from, and Izuku jumped at the sight. He grabbed Bakugou's wrist with one hand and dragged him off as he started taunting her. With his other hand he dialed Uraraka's number and gave her a call to see where she and the others were hanging out. They found her, Sue, Ida, Kirishima, and Ishido all sitting on some bales of hay by a small stand that was selling various hot drinks and cider donuts. We thought you guys died. Ishido yelled to them once she saw they were approaching. Midoriya waved at her, grinning sheepishly. You sure hoofed it when that chainsaw dude came out of the corn, Midoriya. Yeah, sorry for making you guys worry. I didn't mean to get us separated. It's okay. At least you had Bakugou, Kirishima chimed in, blowing on the drink in his hands. He looked at Bakugou and smiled widely. In turn, Bakugou rolled his eyes. Yeah, only 'cause his cowardly, dumb but dragged me along with him in a panic. Kaken. I told you I wasn't scared. I was protecting you. Like hell. I don't need any protecting. Bakugou turned to Izuku, a fist playfully raised at him. Besides, you didn't do shit to protect me. If anything, I protected you. I'm the one who shoved you into the cornstalks so we could get the slip on that lady. Oh, hiding in the maze together? How romantic and brave of both of you, Ishido said with a snicker, kicking at the hay bales under her. She'd climbed to the top of the stack to take a seat above the rest of them. Shut up, Pinky. It was strategic, tactical hiding. Bakugou focused his anger on her instead, practically snarling, which only made Ishido laugh harder. Izuku put a finger on his chin and mused aloud. Your strategic, tactical hiding didn't really work well. She found us, after all. Come to think of it, though, she might have just been trying to guide us to the exit. They probably have a few actors set up near all the exits to help push people in the right direction. The placement of the exit had seemed fairly convenient, after all. It would keep things moving a lot more smoothly. Well, whatever, you two made it out just fine, and it's been exactly 38 minutes since we noticed you were gone. Which means Kirishima is buying us all drinks. Uraraka stuck her tongue out at the redhead. I told you it'd take him longer than a half hour without the map. Kirishima looked defeated and sighed, digging out his wallet. Yeah. What do you guys want? The group all ordered their drinks. And Kirishima, sadly, forked over the cash. Izuku and Ida took pity and helped him distribute the drinks, at least. Izuku handed a styrofoam cup to Bakugou, who'd taken to sitting on a nearby stump. Coffee? No sugar, a splash of whole milk. At this, Bakugou took the cup but shot him a questioning look. How'd you know that, nerd? Well, you make coffee in our room all the time and you keep a pint of whole milk in the mini fridge, so I just figured. Bakugou hummed in agreement, staring down at the dark coffee. He seemed to contemplate it briefly. Do me a favor and stop noticing the details. You get so creepy when you go all analytical on me. Izuku smiled down at his roommate and laughed softly. Sorry. Can't help it. I'll try to be less observant in the future, just for you, Kaken. Bakugou glanced up at him briefly, then huffed, deliberately taking a sip of his coffee. Yeah, well, you better. I didn't say it earlier, but your costume is cool, by the way. I'm really glad you came out with us and even dressed up. I didn't think you'd go with a werewolf, but it suits you. The ears are cute. Bakugou looked back up at him, eyes a bit wide. He absently reached up and touched one of the fake ears that were sitting atop his head, like he'd forgotten about them. Shut up. I'm only wearing it because Kirishima bought the DMN thing for me last year. It's the only costume I have. Izuku blinked at him. Kirishima? Yeah, of course, that made sense. Bakugou hadn't ever been one for celebrations and holidays, after all. Izuku looked down at the cider in his hands and excused himself suddenly. Anyways, I'm gonna go see what Ida's up to. Wait. Bakugou looked like he wanted to say something else, so Izuku gave him a moment. Yeah. Yodada, your costume looks stupid as hell. Izuku frowned and tilted his head. Right. Well, like I said, And no, I mean it fits you. Geez, there's no reason to be in but about it. Izuku looked down at the costume he was wearing. It was a few years old at this point, just a heavily modified bedsheet that he'd sewed some patchwork and a hood onto. It wasn't the scariest, sure, but it was at least more than your stereotypical lazy ghost costume. He'd actually put a decent amount of effort into the accessories and patches. No, I didn't. Bakugou looked flustered for the first time Izuku had ever seen. I meant that it's cute too. Yes. It's not fucking scary at all. But that suits you. Oh. Izuku paused, looking back up at his roommate, and then down at his costume again. Then he grinned. Oh, thanks in that case. It hadn't exactly been a compliment, but with Bakugou you took what you could get. Whatever, nerd. Bakugou was looking away again, and before Izuku could say anything else, Ashido called out to them from her place atop the hay bales. So, Kaminari and Siro just hit us up about the Halloween party they're at. They say it's lit and we gotta go. You guys in? Yelled, cupping her hand around her mouth. Heck yeah. Izuku shouted back, raising his hot cider and splashing some of it on the ground accidentally. Ashido gave an excited yelp and raised her own drink in solidarity before she downed it in a few gulps, which was impressive, considering it was hot chocolate. She jumped down from the hay bales, landing on her feet with a dull thud. Come on, Kaken. It'll be fun. Izuku held out his hand to help Bakugou stand up. The other ignored it, unsurprisingly, and stood up on his own. He shoved his hand in the pocket of his long jacket, and they moved back towards the others. Kaminari says they even have homemade vodka infused with candy corn. Ashido, that sounds super gross, Sue said, sticking her tongue out in disgust, her timed-out soul mark showing as she did so, and maybe a little dangerous. I know. I'm gonna drink so much of it. Ashido agreed, her hands balled into fists in front of her, misplaced determination glittering in her eyes as they all made their way to the bus station down the road. There was a knock on the shared dorm door, startling Izuku from looking at his laptop. He shut the screen and hopped down from his mattress, exclaiming, I got it. Bakugou made no effort to move from his desk, or any other kind of acknowledgement that he'd heard the knock at all. He was wearing his bulky over-the-ear headphones, and Izuku could hear the thin sound of someone screaming lyrics from them. He frowned. His poor roommate was going to end up with tinnitus if he kept that up. Shaking the thought off, Izuku answered the door. Hello, Midoriya. Todoroki greeted him, pleasantly. Ida has started yelling at us for being late in the group chat. He's 15 minutes early, of course, but I figured I'd come get you so we can just head out now so he's not waiting too long. You ready? Izuku sighed and briefly checked his phone. He did indeed have 4 missed messages from Ida in the group chat. He looked back up at Todoroki with an understanding smile. Yeah, let me get my shoes on. Izuku pulled on his red Converse and grabbed his keys and wallet. He yelled a loud goodbye to Bakugou, but the other didn't flinch from staring at his screen and typing intently. He had an essay due for his elective photography class tomorrow, something about the history of some technique or another. He'd warned Izuku earlier that he wasn't going to tolerate any distractions, so Izuku didn't make much more of an effort to say goodbye. He figured eventually Bakugou would realize he was gone, anyways. He tugged his arms through the sleeves of his jackets in the hallway, happily chattering away at his friend about some drama that had happened earlier in the day during one of his classes. And, get this, he came into the lecture hall with a huge bouquet and a teddy bear, like, the whole shebang. This poor girl he was confessing to stood up and just went off on him. It sounded like the dude had been harassing her for months. Can't believe he'd just barge into a classroom like that and think it would work, you know? Can you even imagine dash? Izuku noticed a door at the end of the hallway open amidst his story, recognizing the room as his RA's single. For the most part, he didn't know much about their RA aside from the few times he'd made mandatory rounds to check on them. He and Izuku were on pretty good terms. Bakugou, on the other hand, had received several noise complaints for both screaming while playing video games and for blasting his music on his speakers whenever Izuku wasn't around. Izuku and their RA, though? They didn't have any beef. Izuku waved when the man at the end of the hallway was done locking his door behind him. "Hey there, Yorashi. What's up?" Yorashi turned at the sound of his name. He recognized Izuku immediately and grinned, raising his hand to wave back. He stopped mid-motion, though, grin falling as quickly as it had appeared. This confused Izuku. Yorashi was generally a very intense and excitable person. He'd rarely seen him not grinning. Except for when he was chewing Bakugou out, of course. It was then Izuku noticed Todoroki had fallen a step behind him, too. He turned back to his friend, a questioning look on his face. Todoroki had gone totally still, eyes wide as he stared straight down the hallway at his R. Izuku bounced his gaze back to Yorashi. The other was starting to approach them, his mouth forming a thin line and eyes staring intensely at Todoroki. He breezed past Izuku and stopped in front of his friend, squaring his shoulders and looking down at him with an intimidating air. "Todoroki." "Yorashi." Todoroki said back, his expression unreadable. If it weren't for the nearly imperceptible shake in his voice, even Izuku wouldn't have been able to tell he was at all shaken. Izuku nervously glanced between the two of them, the tension in the air thick. He had no idea what was going on. It was clear the two of them knew each other, but how, Izuku couldn't have guessed. After a couple seconds of silence had passed, he made an attempt to diffuse the situation and cleared his throat before speaking up. So, you guys have already met, then? Oh, so Shoto's never even mentioned me to his friends, has he? Yorashi asked, not bothering to spare a moment and look over at Izuku. Izuku was kind of grateful. His eyes were burning with fierce resentment and he was happy to not be on the receiving end of it. Izuku couldn't stand staying on the sidelines for this confrontation, feeling like he was intruding on what seemed to be some kind of personal grudge. He suddenly made a show of patting his pockets down. "Oh no, Todoroki, I forgot my phone back in the dorm. So I'm just gonna go get it while you and Yorashi, talk," he muttered, taking a step back from the situation so he could escape. Before he could move another step, Todoroki reached out and grabbed his arm, eyes never dropping from Yorashi's. It was like the two of them were locked in a fight for dominance and neither of them were planning on backing down yet. The way his fingers dug into Izuku's arm, sent a very clear message that he did not want to be left alone with Yorashi. Izuku looked down apprehensively at the hand gripping his arm. "A dot or not? Turns out my phone was just in my other pocket all along, I guess," he muttered. Todoroki ignored what he was saying and took in a deep breath. He finally allowed himself to glance over at Izuku and then back at Yorashi, as if he were trying to think carefully about what he said next. "Midoriya, I'd like you to meet my soulmate." Izuku had made a total butt of himself the first time he met Todoroki. He'd seen him changing in gym class and, noticing the soul mark low on his shoulder blade was at 0, he had immediately jumped at him with questions. He'd started nervously, showing off his own soul mark to this kid he'd never really talked to before and rambling about how he'd never met anyone his age with a soul mark at 0 either. Todoroki's immediate and admittedly rational reaction was to tell him to F off, albeit much more politely than that. He'd grabbed his backpack and booked it out of the locker room so quickly that Izuku had trouble catching up to apologize. He tugged on his own t-shirt and ran after him, out of the locker room. "Wait, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have brought it up out of the blue like that. I just got overly excited, I thought I've never met anyone else besides adults who. Izuku trailed off as Todoroki spun around and glared at him, eyes wide and angry. Izuku had followed him out into the very open and public halls of their high school, and several students were staring at the commotion Izuku had caused, waiting for the drama to unfold so they could gossip about it immediately. Izuku realized that he had almost just shouted to the whole school about this stranger's soul mark, without even having a clue who he was or if it was a secret or not. The other was lucky to have the luxury of his mark being on a place that was easy to keep hidden most of the time, unlike Izuku, who quite literally wore his soul mark on his sleeve. Sorry. Izuku apologized again, voice quiet this time. He wrung his hands together, fidgeting. He wasn't exactly sure what to say next. He hadn't planned any further. What do you want from me? The other spoke with venom on his tongue. I guess I just wanted to apologize. I'm Midoriya. Izuku Midoriya. From class 3. I haven't seen you around until this year. The other looked him up and down, eyes cold and scrutinizing. Well, Midoriya, I'm going to ask you to leave me alone now. I really mean it. I'm sorry about the way I acted. I shouldn't have asked you about your, Izuku glanced around. Most of the other students were ignoring them now that there was no apparent drama happening, but he was still worried after almost majorly screwing up a few minutes ago. I was just hoping maybe you'd want it. I don't know, talk about it. But I shouldn't have assumed anything. Can I ask your name? I would have already given you my name if I wanted you to have it. I'm going to go now. Please don't follow me. Izuku sighed softly, yet that's fair. I won't mention it again. See you next gym class. The other didn't turn around and kept on his way down the hall. Izuku quickly learned Todoroki's name through their class roll call once he'd started paying attention, but it was weeks before the two of them had to interact again. Occasionally, they ended up as class partners, and the whole time Todoroki refused to be anything but forcibly polite with him. Izuku found it hard not to notice that Todoroki didn't seem to have any friends. So, Izuku was determined to be relentlessly nice. Recklessly nice, some might say. He made an effort to talk to him whenever possible and even sought him out during lunch sometimes to sit and eat with him. The first few times, Todoroki picked up his tray and moved to a different table, but eventually he sat through Izuku's attempts at small talk and gave one-word replies. Slow but steady progress. And then, one day, Izuku brought his other friends with him, too. He invited Uraraka and Ida to come sit with him. Todoroki was quiet at first, and even seemed annoyed at times that his life had been invaded, but he didn't leave anymore. He actually began opening up and talking and, over time, even laughing with them. Before they knew it, Todoroki had joined their little friend circle whether he'd liked it or not. It was hard to tell with him, but Izuku was fairly certain he liked it. It was at a party towards the end of their junior year 8 months since they'd met that Todoroki pulled Izuku aside from the rest of the small crowd. There was a bonfire in the backyard of the house where most of their classmates were gathered. Todoroki brought him to the steps at the front of the house and sat down. Izuku followed suit despite his confusion, unsure of what it was that Todoroki wanted from him. When we first met, you asked me about my soul mark. Izuku felt instantly embarrassed at the memory. It had been months since the incident, but he still felt pretty terrible about it. He looked at the ground and opened his mouth to apologize again, but Todoroki cut him off before he could start. Do you still want to know? Izuku looked back up at his friend, frowning. What? I mean not if it's something uncomfortable for you to talk about. It's really not any of my business if you don't want to dash. No, Midoriya, I want to talk about it. With you. You've told me about your soul mark already, and I would like to return the favor. Izuku would have been lying if he said he wasn't intrigued. He was fairly open about his soul mark among his friends, but Todoroki had remained tight-lipped about his the entire school year. Izuku had not dared to ask him about it again, after he'd messed up so badly on their first meeting. So he just nodded encouragingly at his friend. Todoroki took a moment to collect his thoughts, and then began, My timer didn't start at 0. I was actually just born with a fairly short timer. I met my soulmate in middle school. I had been dreading the moment since I understood the concept of soulmates well enough. Todoroki looked at Izuku briefly. You know how my father's in but? Well, a big part of that is how he treats the idea of soulmates. How he treats my mother. Todoroki did not elaborate on that point. He didn't have to. I don't like the concept of soulmates. In fact, I think the whole thing is insane. I think it drives people to be their worst. To throw away who they are to be with a certain person. For every pair of soulmates that are happy, there's so many who force themselves through misery to chase after this nebulous concept of destiny. Izuku didn't say anything, watching Todoroki intensely as he spoke. The other shook his head, red and white dyed hair falling into his eyes. I'm getting off track. I met my soulmate back when I was 12. I'd been hoping to avoid the whole interaction altogether by hiding in a supply closet, but it unfortunately made it worse. He walked in to get something for a teacher right as my soul mark counted down, and since I was the only person there, it was obvious we were each other's soulmates. He was so excited, but I told him I wanted nothing to do with him and I just left. I brushed him off entirely. I didn't even explain anything. Todoroki looked frustrated with himself. He put his head in his hands. We're always told growing up that it's supposed to be the best moment in our lives. I resented that, and I still do, but looking back on it, I absolutely ruined that moment for someone else, for entirely selfish reasons. Izuku gave his friend a few moments of quiet before he spoke up. Did you ever see him again? Todoroki lifted his face from his palms and rested his chin on them instead. He reached out a few times, but we moved here once I was 13 and I was happy to get away at the time. Part of me wishes I could apologize now. Izuku bit his lower lip in thought, not sure what to say to comfort his friend. He settled for putting a hand on his shoulder. It's not your fault that you weren't ready. 12 has gotta be the weirdest age to meet a soulmate. When you're young enough, you don't care about that kind of thing, but when you're a little older, you have just enough time to start thinking about that kind of thing seriously, but not enough time to actually settle any emotions around it, you know. The other looked unconvinced, staring into the distant darkness of the front yard. I took my resentments towards my father out on him. I've forced someone to live without a soulmate. How can you not think I'm a horrible person now that you know that? You, of all people? There are worse things than not having a soulmate, don't you think? Like agreeing to a commitment you're not ready for just because a number on your shoulder tells you that you should. Izuku asked, tilting his head at Todoroki. Todoroki didn't say anything. He just looked straight ahead, clearly unconvinced and still troubled. Izuku had to wonder how long this had been building up and bothering him. No wonder he'd reacted so poorly to Izuku when they'd first met. Izuku squeezed his shoulder. You're not a bad person, and you're not your father just because you made a mistake when you were 12 and hurt your soulmate. The fact that you feel remorse about it is already telling, isn't it? At that, Todoroki finally looked over at him, his eyes searching and uncertain. Izuku smiled gently in return. At this, Todoroki's face softened. Did I suppose you have a point? Izuku was relieved to hear this. If you ever meet him again, you can set things right. At least explain yourself so that he can understand. I'm sure things will be okay, but don't worry about it until then. Inasa Yorashi was Todoroki's soulmate, the one he'd snubbed 6 years ago, that Izuku had only heard about briefly during that party. He'd been talking casually with Todoroki's soulmate for months at this point, totally clueless. It's a bit late for you to be calling me your soulmate at this point, Yorashi said, unflinching in his animosity. Yorashi. I don't really want to hear whatever you have to say. Yorashi frowned at the other and looked down at him, fists clenched at his side. If he was expecting some kind of fight, he did not get it. Instead, Todoroki bowed his head and spoke quickly as though he was either afraid he'd chicken out or Yorashi would leave before he'd finished. I'm sorry. I treated you poorly in the past. I completely understand you don't wish to talk to me. If you would ever allow me the chance to explain myself, I live on the 5th floor. The other crossed his arms, nose crinkling in distaste to disguise the flash of surprise that had passed across his face. He obviously hadn't been expecting an apology right off the bat, which was understandable. Bakugou wasn't the only person who'd changed over the years. Todoroki had been standoffish and cold even when high school had rolled around and Izuku had initially met him. If Yorashi had been expecting that Todoroki, then of course he'd be surprised. The taller man left in a huff, turning on his heel and heading down the hallway towards the elevators without a word of reply. Todoroki didn't move, keeping his head bowed until Izuku put a hand on his shoulder. Are you okay? He didn't look okay, but he nodded regardless, mouth set into a grim line. Let's take the stairs down to the lobby, yeah? The others won't mind if we're a little late, I'm sure. Izuku suggested, pointing his thumb over his shoulder to indicate to the stairwell that was on the opposite end of the hall from the elevators. It wouldn't be good to run into Yurashi again right after their brief but tense meeting. The other nodded silently. For what it's worth, Todoroki, I still don't think you're a bad person. Thanks, Midoriya, he replied, softly. They made their way down the stairs in comfortable silence. Izuku knew by now to let Todoroki have his space when he needed it. Izuku was certain he didn't want to look at another textbook for the rest of his life. Nearly 3 months into classes and he was already going to be a dropout. He had no idea why he ever thought being a doctor was a good idea, considering he'd doomed himself to roughly 8 more years of this kind of intensive study workload. He knew these general education courses were only the tip of the iceberg, too. It wasn't that he found the work itself difficult, it was just the juggling of 5 different mandatory subjects on top of a 6th, optional history class he'd signed up for. He'd maybe been too ambitious for his first semester. He groaned and put his head down on his book. It hurt his forehead after a minute, but he couldn't be bothered to move. He was on his 7th near-consecutive hour of studying, since he had 3 exams coming up on Monday and 1 on Tuesday. He'd blocked off this whole weekend to study. Today, he was studying for the aforementioned history class. Tomorrow, he was meeting up with Uraraka and possibly Bakugou to work on chemistry and biology. History was the most grueling because of the sheer amount of pure memorization. At the very least, he was grateful that he had a knack for absorbing this kind of information. He was very good at studying, but he was also very good at being paranoid. He worried often that, despite his good grades, he was never doing enough. It was what drove him to have moments like this, where he sat with his nose quite literally in a book at 11 p.m., contemplating all his life choices leading to this moment. He told himself he was just going to rest his eyes for a few minutes, take a short mental break, and then power through his last 2 lecture notes and chapters of the textbook. Just 5 minutes. Yo nerd, what the F dash? Izuku jolted awake as he felt something shake his shoulder rather violently. The page of his textbook that he'd fallen asleep on stuck to his cheek and tore slightly as he sat up straight in his wooden desk chair. He looked up at Bakugou, eyes squinted slightly, one cheek red from where he'd been resting it on the book, and his hair a bit tousled. He brought the heels of his palms to his eyes and rubbed away the sleep. Sheet, what time is it, Kaken? He asked, his voice sounding a bit scratchy. He answered his own question by tapping on his phone. It lit up, 12:23 a.m. He'd fallen asleep for nearly an hour and a half. Have you even moved since I left? Bakugou asked, putting his hand down on Izuku's desk and leaning in close to his face, frowning as he inspected the other. I mean, to, go to the bathroom and get water and stuff, yeah. So you haven't left the dorm all day then? Oh, I guess not, Izuku muttered. He'd eaten a granola bar for breakfast and done some homework assignments in the morning and afternoon before he'd started studying around 4 p.m. Have you even eaten dinner? Or lunch, for that matter? Izuku laughed, uncomfortable. He looked away from Bakugou, scratching his jaw as a nervous tick. I forgot, is all. All right, Space Cadet, it's break time. Come in, Kaken. I promise I'll go to bed after I finish looking over these last few lecture notes. I won't have time to read them tomorrow, so I really need dash. What you really need is a FING meal, you idiot. No wonder you passed out at your desk. You haven't eaten anything in over 24 hours. Bakugou insisted, his voice more aggressive than what he was actually saying. Izuku protested, that's not true. I had a granola bar this morning. Bakugou glared down at Izuku and then, in one swift motion, grabbed his arm and dragged him up out of his desk chair. Come on. I keep some sheet in the kitchen downstairs. Let's throw something together, I'm starving too. Wait, what? Kaken, it's almost 1 a.m. What's your point? Izuku didn't really have anything to say to that. It was getting late, sure, but it's not like he'd been planning to sleep for another hour or so anyways, so it wasn't like that was the issue. Bakugou seemed to take his silence as permission to continue pulling him out the door by his forearm. He finally let Izuku go when they were out in the hallway. Izuku didn't even know where the communal kitchen was. He wasn't much of a chef himself. The most he did in the way of cooking was heating up his mom's leftovers or boiling water in the electric kettle for cup ramen. He was actually kind of surprised that Bakugou, apparently, had food and supplies he kept down there. It turned out that the kitchen was buried in the basement of the building. It was well lit, relatively clean, and currently barren of other students. Izuku figured the late hour and the fact that it was a weekend had everything to do with that. Bakugou set to work immediately, grabbing a Tupperware from the freezer and tossing it on the counter. Izuku caught a glimpse of the labels he'd put on the lid of the container, written in thick Sharpie and scrawling print. Curry 1113, touch this and die. Izuku covered his mouth to hide a laugh. He had to wonder if Bakugou had experienced someone stealing his food in the past. He wouldn't doubt it since there were a lot of people living in this building. College kids got desperate sometimes. He pulled down a bin from one of the cupboards, which was also labeled with his name and a similar message. He seemed to take a quick inventory of his stuff before plopping a half-used bag of rice and a medium sauce pot on the counter. Izuku took a seat at one of the communal tables, folding his legs up under himself. He rested his elbows on the table, and then rested his head in his hand with a sigh. He watched Bakugou do his prep work quietly for a few moments, before he started feeling a bit awkward. He would have offered to help if he didn't already know that Bakugou would have refused. Instead, he settled on some small talk to ease the quiet. Do you cook often? Yeah. Didn't buy a meal card from the cafeteria, way too expensive. You can get groceries and takeout for a lot cheaper. The food's better too. I'm pretty fucking good in the kitchen. Izuku hummed and fiddled with his ID card. He had personally gone ahead and gotten a full meal plan with the school, considering he had no idea how to cook for himself. Even if the cafeteria food was mediocre, it was definitely better than trying to scrounge for himself or attempting to learn how to cook on top of all his studies. That's pretty cool, actually. I didn't even know that you knew how to cook. You don't really seem the type. Bakugou angrily turned the water on in the sink to start washing the rice. The F, is that supposed to mean, huh? I didn't mean anything bad. Izuku said, nervously, trying to backpedal and correct himself. I just meant that it's a bit domestic, is all. And you're not really the domestic type, at a glance. That's all. There's a lot you don't know about me, Deku, Bakugou huffed, using his hands to wash the rice, his movements harsh but practiced. Don't start thinking you know everything. Izuku conceded at that, since it was definitely true. At one point in time he'd known Bakugou better than anyone else, but these past few months had proven to him that he had a lot of catching up to do still. He let his elbows slide on the table until he was sitting hunched over with his head laying down in his folded arms. His eyelids felt heavy. He really was tired, now that the panic of studying wasn't an option presented to him. His little nap from earlier had just been a tease of sleep, and now, he felt like he wanted to do nothing more than crawl into bed. He shook his head after a few seconds and reached for his phone in the pocket of his shorts. He tapped a few buttons until music started playing, loud and a little bit tinny as it rattled from the small speakers. Bakugou drained the water from the rice and looked back at him, one eyebrow arched in a silent question. Just put on some top 40s playlist. I'm gonna fall asleep waiting if I don't have something to keep me up, Izuku explained. He didn't even really love pop music or anything, but it was usually upbeat and fast-paced and would keep him attentive, hopefully. Bakugou didn't say anything or complain, even though Izuku knew this also was not the music of his choice. He just kept on with his cooking, filling the pot with water and leaving it on the burner to boil while he moved on to thawing the frozen, pre-made curry in the microwave. Despite the music, Izuku found himself starting to drift off again, eyes drooping slightly as he watched Bakugou work. After about 10 minutes or so of prep, everything must have been set in motion, because Bakugou started up a timer on the oven and took a seat on the counter, pulling out his own phone and glancing over at Izuku only briefly before barking at him. The least you can do is stay awake, you ingrate. Izuku whined and closed his eyes completely, putting his head down. You're the one who wouldn't let me sleep. You wouldn't have gone to bed, anyways. You would have tried to keep yourself awake to study more. Hence why you passed out on your textbook in the first place, idiot. Izuku knew Bakugou was right, but he still grunted in protest. He let out a deep sigh and forced himself to sit upright in the chair, eyes needing to adjust to the brightness of the room from the short time he'd had them closed. Another boppy song started playing on his phone, and Izuku suddenly got an idea for how to stay awake. He peered over at Bakugou with a devious smile. The other looked kind of sleepy too, or, at the very least, he looked bored as he scrolled through his phone absently. Izuku stood up, pushing the chair out behind him. He approached Bakugou and snatched the phone from his hands, holding it above his head playfully. "Hey!" Bakugou yelled, eyes widening as he realized what had happened. He hopped down from the counter and reached up to grab his phone back. Bakugou had a height advantage on him, but Izuku had quick reflexes. He sashayed out of the way and to the side of Bakugou, sliding his phone down onto the counter. When the blonde turned on his heel to grab for his phone again, Izuku intercepted him and took hold of his wrists so he could tug him out towards the open floor space between the kitchen and the dining room. Bakugou, for his part, stumbled slightly and resisted the pull at his wrists, looking terribly confused. "The hell are you trying to do, Deku?" Izuku had to laugh. Bakugou looked almost cute with how lost his expression was. "Isn't it obvious?" he asked, taking his hand from one of Bakugou's wrists and putting it on his upper arm. He outstretched their other arms in a mock waltz-like pose, dancing. "To keep us awake." Bakugou looked like he might punch him at any moment. "I don't dance," he insisted, stiffening as Izuku tried to get him to move along with the beat of the music. "This is stupid." "Oh, come on. That's not true. I've seen you dance, Kaken. At parties? You're good at it." Izuku figured if Bakugou wasn't going to move, he still could. He took Bakugou's hand into his own and raised their extended arms up, spinning himself under the little arch they'd made together. Unlike a certain someone, he was fairly willing to make a fool of himself if it meant having fun, and especially if it meant he might be able to make Bakugou smile. Bakugou watched him intently, brows furrowed. He instinctively tugged Izuku back, and the other obliged by performing another secondary twirl, right back into their starting position. This time, Bakugou fell into the stance more naturally, resting his free hand on Izuku's back without thinking. Clearly, he wasn't as unfamiliar with the basics of dancing as he claimed to be. There's a difference between being good at dancing and being drunk. "And you were drunk, Deku?" Bakugou mused, looking down at him. Izuku grinned, something smug about his smile. "We're not talking about me though, are we?" Bakugou let out a snort of laughter. "Well, there's a difference between thinking someone is good at dancing and being drunk too." "You got me there, I guess," Izuku agreed, guiding Bakugou by the shoulder gently to move with him. Bakugou, however, resisted again. This time, though, he instead pulled Izuku to move in his direction, to step with him and follow his lead. Izuku had to resist rolling his eyes. Honestly, did everything have to be a competition with him? He let Bakugou have his way for now, deciding it was better not to push his luck. He didn't really mind letting Bakugou take the lead. It meant he was having fun, right? "How much do you know about dancing anyways?" Bakugou asked, the two of them moving their feet in step, albeit a bit awkwardly. It wasn't elegant in any kind of way, showing that in reality, neither of them had a very solid grasp on proper dance moves beyond some beginner steps. It had certainly been a while since Izuku had needed to dance formally, at least. "Not much," Izuku admitted, feeling his face heat up. He tried not to focus too hard on his footwork. If he did, he knew he'd be sure to mess it up. "Todoroki taught me some basics." "Todoroki?" "Yeah, my friend with red and white hair. He's definitely been around our dorm a few times and to some of those parties. We went to high school together, Izuku explained. He knew Bakugou was bad with names, but surely he'd remember someone like Todoroki. He had a fairly unique look with his dyed hair and the scar by his eye. No. I know who you're talking about, idiot. How the hell was he the one who taught you dance steps?" Bakugou asked, tilting his head a bit. Izuku blinked up at him and shrugged his shoulders. "There was a big, formal family event he invited me to our senior year. It was a wedding for one of his older siblings, I think. The whole family was there and he took me as his +1. You dated half and half?" Izuku frowned at the nickname but didn't comment on it. "Sort of. He more invited me as the most likely to provide emotional support and least likely to start a scene if his dad did something shitty. Also, he felt I was the most likely to stop him from making a scene with his family, Izuku explained, without getting into too much detail. It had been a fun, if not emotionally taxing night. Bakugou led Izuku into another twirl, and Izuku happily spun on his feet, socks slipping slightly on the linoleum floor. He was internally delighted that, somehow, he'd gotten Bakugou to play along with him just this once. Bakugou, despite his actions, still sounded as grumpy as ever. What does sort of mean? Izuku pulled himself back from the twirl and fell into their step motions again. It was weird for Bakugou to be so interested in his past all of the sudden. Normally they didn't talk about this kind of stuff, but Izuku didn't really mind. We went on a couple of dates, I guess, but we were better as friends. Does it matter? What? Bakugou asked, looking a bit taken aback. He messed up his footwork and ended up stepping on Izuku's foot. Izuku winced slightly, but didn't comment on it out of politeness. Bakugou looked down at their feet and cussed before falling back into the proper step pattern, movements a bit stilted now. No, of course not. You're just so fucking vague sometimes, is all. I don't care. Of course not. How'd you learn anyways? Huh. To dance. How'd you learn to dance? Bakugou grumbled something under his breath, sounding annoyed. Don't laugh, it's so stupid. I got stuck in a dance elective for a semester of gym class last year. We were called randomly to choose from a bunch of different electives, and I went dead fucking last, so it was the only thing open. Never heard the end of it from Ishido and Kaminari. Izuku laughed. I said don't laugh, UD dash dot. If looks could kill. I'm sorry, that sounds so awful. Izuku laughed a little harder despite the threatening look in Bakugou's eyes, but his tone of voice was earnestly sympathetic. Every kid had suffered through a gym dance class at some point or another, but a whole semester sounded like torture. However, the mental image of Bakugou in some basketball shorts and a graphic t-shirt trying to learn ballroom dance politely with a bunch of equally awkward teenagers was pretty funny. He felt Bakugou's hand on his back tighten its grip, so he bit his lower lip to keep himself from giggling any more. Sorry. But I bet you never thought it'd be a skill that came in handy at 1 a.m. in a communal dorm kitchen. Handy? I think it's more of a nuisance, Bakugou scoffed. No one's forcing you to dance with me, Kakin. Bakugou rolled his eyes, despite the blush that had showed up on his cheeks. F off, you know Dimin well you're but would be asleep on the table otherwise, and then I'd just have to drag you back up to the 12th god Dimin floor. No thanks. Izuku sometimes wished Bakugou could just admit he was capable of having fun and being a normal young adult like the rest of them. Then again, it just wouldn't be Bakugou if he wasn't always putting up a defensive, angry front. Izuku sighed in mock defeat. You're probably right, Kakin. As always. Oh, don't start with your sarcasm, smartass. I don't want to hear dash. Bakugou was cut off by a loud, shrill beeping that came from the oven. They both jumped slightly, having forgotten about the alarm that had been set for the rice. Bakugou dropped his hands from Izuku's quickly, stepping away from him and out of their dance position to turn back to the kitchen. After punching the timer button again to make the oven be quiet, he pulled the lid off of the pot and used a wooden spoon to fluff the rice. Izuku was left with some kind of whiplash with how quickly Bakugou had retreated from him. After a moment he shook it off and returned to his seat at the table where his phone was still playing a loud pop song. He pressed a button on the side and turned the volume down a bit, the room now mostly quiet aside from the clanging of Bakugou plating their very late dinner. Here's your fucking food, lazy bisuri. Bakugou said when he loudly placed a plate of curry in front of Izuku, spoon cradled under the rice. It looked amazing and Izuku suddenly realized that he really was starving. So he dug into it after a quick thanks, grateful to find it didn't just look amazing. Oh my god, Kakin, this is so good. Why have you been hiding this secret skill from me while I suffer and eat terrible cafeteria food and dollar store ramen? Izuku whined, lamenting all of the bad meals he'd had in the past few months. He really missed home-cooked meals now. Don't get used to it. Learn how to cook for yourself, dumps. I'm not your personal chef. Bakugou said, pointing his spoon at Izuku accusingly between bites. And don't think I'm going to do this every time you space out and forget to eat. Next time you can DMN well starve. It's too late. You've already conditioned the bad behavior by giving me food. I'm gonna start passing out on my textbooks more than ever, Izuku said, only half joking. He'd easily give up 2 shitty meals if it meant he got one good, homemade one. If I see you passed out at your desk again, I'm just leaving your butt there. Your sore neck'll be karma enough for trying to trick me into making food for you. Izuku swallowed his next bite and snickered, You're as mean as ever, aren't you? At this, Bakugou let out a short laugh himself, only 'cause you're still a weakling after all this time. Izuku rested his head on his fist, looking over at Bakugou with an amused smile. Some things never change, I guess. For a moment, Bakugou's eyes lingered on him, expression thoughtful. He turned his gaze back to his plate, pushing at the food with his fork. Yeah, guess not. Nerd. Hey nerd, Bakugou said as he shoved past the door and into their dorm room. It was a Wednesday evening and Izuku was laying on his stomach in bed, watching the newest episode in a spin-off show about his favorite superhero's sidekick. Izuku didn't look up from his laptop, but waved his hands silently in acknowledgement. He was determined to stay focused on the screen in front of him, watching some building explode dramatically. Clearly taking issue with Izuku's decision to mostly ignore him, Bakugou tugged an earbud from Izuku's ear. Hey! Izuku yelped in response, quickly tapping the spacebar on his laptop to pause the video. He snatched his headphone back, frowning up at his roommate. What gives, Kaken? I'm kind of in the middle of something. You're about to be in the middle of something more important. Get up, get out of your pajamas, I need a favor. Bakugou demanded, putting his hands on his hips. Izuku raised an eyebrow. A favor? You need my help with something? He was skeptical. Bakugou didn't ask for help. That either meant he was planning something, or he was actually desperate. Either way, it caught Izuku's attention. He glanced at his frozen laptop screen and finally popped his other earbud out, shifting so that he was sitting now and could look up at the blonde more comfortably. More like I'm giving you the privilege of helping me out. Bakugou scoffed. It was his way of saying yes, he needed help. Well, what is it? I need a model for my photography assignment due on Friday. Like this Friday? That gave Izuku pause. He tilted his head, thinking he hadn't heard Bakugou correctly for a moment. He knew Bakugou was in a photography elective, so that much made sense, but it was still an odd request. Are you asking me to model for you? He asked, disbelief clear in his tone. Also, why so last minute? You're not one to procrastinate on assignments. Bakugou rolled his eyes and crossed his arms across his chest defensively. Look, Kirishima had agreed last week, but he cancelled on me. So now I need someone else. The assignment requires a person who isn't ourselves in the photo. Izuku looked at his laptop again, longingly, and then back at Bakugou, who was glaring at him. Why not Siro or Kaminari? Or Ishido? Are you joking? Bakugou asked, tone incredulous. When Izuku didn't say anything, he explained himself further. Kaminari or Ishido would absolutely refuse to take the whole thing seriously. They'd be nightmares to work with. Siro might be fine, but they all live pretty far off campus anyways. You're here, which is convenient. Yeah, convenient for you, Izuku said. I kind of already had plans tonight. You're just gonna lay in bed watching TV all fucking night. Don't lie to me. You misunderstand. Those are the plans I'm referring to. So what if his plans were to laze around in bed and eat cup ramen while catching up on his TV shows? He had earned this free time after submitting 2 essays and having had another grueling workout with Ida earlier in the day. He was tired. Come on, stop being a fatbutt and get dressed. Izuku frowned at his roommate, but gave it some consideration. Bakugou really must have been pretty desperate to come to him of all people and ask for help. He made a small thumph noise and turned back to his computer. Well, if you're going to be rude to me, then I'm really not going to help you out. Deku. Bakugou growled, baring his teeth. It was almost funny how dramatic he was. Kaken? Izuku asked, feigning innocence as he put his earbuds back in, hand hovering above the space bar threateningly. The other threw his arms up into the air. Alright, fine. I'll make you dinner whenever you want if you do this for me. You piece of shit. Izuku had been expecting an apology, But of course Bakugou would rather strike up a deal than apologize for anything. Izuku didn't mind and grinned at him. Make it 3 dinners. F. 2 dinners. Deal. Izuku held out his hand to his roommate, and the other reluctantly shook on it. He hopped down from his bed and quickly changed out of his pajama pants and back into jeans. He looked down at his t-shirt. It was an old tie-dyed relic from a summer camp he'd gone to a few years back, and then looked at Bakugou. Should I change out of this shirt too? He'd never modeled for anything before. The closest he'd been was that one summer Tsu had gotten a Polaroid camera and didn't stop taking pictures at all their hangouts for 3 months, so he didn't really know what to expect. Bakugou looked him over briefly and nodded. Yeah, you kinda look like Sheet. Hold on. Bakugou shoved past him and began carting through the clothes hanging in Izuku's closet. As far as fashion went, Izuku wasn't very trendy, so he wasn't sure what Bakugou was trying to find. It seemed the other didn't find what he was expecting after all. Bakugou looked back at Izuku with disdain but mercifully chose not to comment on his wardrobe. Instead, he moved over to his own closet and began digging through his belongings. He pulled out a red flannel and a black sweater and held them both up to Izuku, before throwing the black sweater at him and putting the flannel back. Izuku caught the sweater and traded it for the t-shirt he was currently wearing. It was clearly meant to be baggy, the cuffs of the sleeves falling halfway past his hands. He pushed them to his elbows, tugging at the unfamiliar article with some discomfort. It was actually very comfortable and warm, but it was just weird to be wearing something that wasn't his. Bakugou nodded. Your Converse and those jeans'll be fine. You're probably not gonna be the main focus of the picture, anyways. Izuku listened to Bakugou and pulled his shoes on, pausing briefly to look in the mirror. Roll the cuffs of your jeans too. It'll look better. Bakugou commented, standing by the doorway, clearly waiting to go. Izuku sighed and did as instructed. He kneeled and rolled the fabric twice so that his ankles showed. Happy? He asked as he stood up straight again and grabbed his jacket on their way out into the hallway. No, Bakugou said, locking the door behind them and promptly shoving his hands into the pockets of his jacket. Izuku laughed. Of course not, Bakugou was never happy. Where are we going anyways? Izuku asked, glancing at the time on his phone. It wasn't too late, just a bit past 9 p.m. at the moment. Dunno. The street. I'll know the right place when I see it. I have a basic idea of what I want to do for this shoot. Izuku groaned. Really? You dragged me out of bed and you don't even know where we're going? You weren't doing anything else, so shut up. Bakugou pushed the button to call the elevator. I was watching the newest episode of S.H.I.E.L.D., you know, that show about All Might's sidekick. Izuku asked, leaning forward and looking over at Bakugou with a knowing smile. Try as he might to deny that he still liked their shared childhood hero, Izuku knew the truth. Bakugou stared straight ahead and didn't say anything. The down arrow lit up and there was a ding before the doors opened and they stepped into the elevator, standing next to each other in the small space. Bakugou glanced at him briefly from the corner of his eyes. Is it any good? The doors shut as Izuku's face lit up with delight and he launched into a thorough analysis of the show. What about here? Izuku asked, pointing to a park bench near a lone tree that had lost most of its leaves in the cold. They were still looking for a good place to shoot, even after 45 minutes of wandering around. Dead trees were artsy, right? Symbolic? Bakugou glanced at the bench and the tree and then sent Izuku a look, as if to ask, what the F dash? Izuku shrugged and then sighed, burying his face in the fur collar of his coat. It was cold tonight, and he really just wanted to go back to his warm bed. He regretted agreeing to this. Even Bakugou's cooking wasn't good enough to be sacrificing his spare time so completely. At this rate, it didn't seem like they were ever going to find a spot that fit Bakugou's artistic vision. Well, okay, what are you looking for, Kakin? You've turned down all my suggestions. 'Cause they see, he muttered, eyes scanning the streets and alleys as they walked around. I told you, I'll know it when I see it. I haven't seen it yet, so shut up and stop complaining. You know, I'm a little surprised by how seriously you're taking this. It's just an elective. Can't we just take the shot anywhere? Izuku asked, voice muffled by his collar as he spoke. Bakugou let out a frustrated huff in response. Elective or not, I'm not here to half-butt anything. It all goes towards our cumulative G, dumbass, and if I'm gonna fucking crush everyone else, this counts just as much as anything else. Now, seriously, shut up, Bakugou insisted, as if Izuku's talking was breaking his concentration. Dejected, Izuku pulled out his phone and started scrolling through it. He opened his group chat with Ida, Tsu, and Uraraka and sent a message complaining about how cold it was out and how his legs hurt from his earlier run. He was hoping someone would listen and care about his plight. He waited a few seconds. No one seemed to be immediately online. Wonderful. He sent a text to Kirishima in the meantime. Midoriya, hey Kirishima. Hope everything's alright. Kaken told me you had to cancel on him. Kirishima, hey man. I'm good, but what are you even talking ABTL? Midoriya, the photography assignment? Kaken said he asked you to. In the middle of typing the reply, Bakugou smacked his upper arm. Yo, nerd, I think I found it. Izuku looked up at the other and saw he was pointing ahead of them. Abandoning his text conversation, he turned his head to look and saw a small, unassuming liquor store with gaudy neon signs in its window, a myriad of colored lights glowing through the glass and pouring into the dark street. Izuku was kind of surprised. There wasn't anything remarkable about this storefront aside from the mass amount of bright advertisements. We walked around downtown for 45 minutes and this is where you want to photograph? Yes, Bakugou said, his voice curt and sure. He grabbed at the bag slung across his chest and unzipped it, carefully pulling the sizable camera from its case. He fiddled with it for a moment and turned it on, seeming to adjust some things before putting the camera's strap around his neck. He directed Izuku to go stand near the window of the store. Awkwardly, Izuku did as he was told, standing stiffly by the storefront. He turned back to his roommate. So, do you want me to, like, pose? Or something? He asked, suddenly unsure of what to do with his limbs, or how to turn his feet, or which direction to look. It didn't help that there were still people occasionally walking down the sidewalk, gawking at them briefly. It wasn't entirely unusual for friends to take pictures of each other in the more tourist-friendly parts of the city, but this was definitely not a tourist site. Bakugou gave it some thought, staring at Izuku and seeming to mull the question over very seriously. He held up his camera and looked through the little window on it before approaching Izuku. Back up a little, he instructed, pushing Izuku backwards by his shoulders. He unzipped Izuku's jacket, looked him up and down with scrutiny, and then told him to just take it off. Begrudgingly, he did so and handed the article to Bakugou, bracing himself for the cold. He hoped the shoot wouldn't take as long as finding this diamond store had. Bakugou backed up and held his camera to his face again. He gave Izuku a few different instructions. Lean against the window. Turn your head to the left. No, your left, dumbass. Crouch down. Okay, not like that. Never mind, stand back up. That looked dumb as shit. Move your bangs out of your eyes, for F's sake. This went on for probably 20 minutes, but it felt like an eternity to Izuku. He was trying to act cool, but he found the whole thing kind of embarrassing. He didn't actually enjoy being on this end of a camera, and the tips of his fingers were starting to feel numb in the cold. Bakugou seemed to think the temperature only added to the atmosphere of the photo. Apparently the fact that it was cold enough that Izuku could see his breath made for some cool photos. Izuku just wanted to put his jacket back on. As if reading his mind, Bakugou tossed Izuku his coat and declared them finished. Izuku happily grabbed at it and pulled it back on as quickly as he could, rubbing his hands together to warm them up. Alright, dweeb, that's a wrap. I think I can work with the stuff I got. Bakugou took a seat on the ledge by the store's window, clicking through the photographs he'd taken, turning the camera every once in a while. Izuku was busy keeping himself warm, but soon enough his curiosity got the better of him. He sat down next to his roommate and put his chin on his shoulder, peering at the camera's screen. Bakugou grunted and half-heartedly tried to shake Izuku off, but didn't try too hard when the other didn't budge. Some of the photos definitely turned out better than others, but Izuku was overall quite surprised. Wow. I'm not very photogenic, but some of these are really cool, Izuku said, staring as Bakugou flipped through them. Looking at the final product, he now understood why Bakugou liked this location. It was farther from the main downtown area, so it was a bit darker and the colors from the neon lights reflected off of his skin in a way that contrasted that darkness well. It looked like something out of some gritty cyberpunk movie. He was glad he hadn't worn his stupid summer camp t-shirt. The black sweater fit in perfectly, understated and simple. They look good, 'cause I'm the best, obviously. Don't start thinking it has anything to do with you, Deku, Bakugou replied, clicking a button twice and zooming in to inspect something. Send me these, I want to make one of them my profile picture. Izuku exclaimed, feeling genuinely excited for the first time tonight. Yeah. Bakugou muttered, still singularly focused on the screen. They were quiet for a moment, before Izuku held out his hand towards Bakugou, palm up. Can I see it? What? The camera? Bakugou asked, turning to him. Izuku nodded. No. It belongs to the school, and these things are expensive. If you break it, I can't afford to replace it. Bakugou said, frowning. Oh come on, I won't break it. Izuku kept his hand out insistently. I just want to look at it. I've never seen a fancy camera like that before, it looks so neat. Bakugou looked down at the outstretched hand for a moment and then hesitantly took the camera's strap off of his neck. He placed the strap around Izuku's neck instead and gingerly put the camera in his palm. If you do break it, you're paying for it. Got that, nerd? And don't touch any buttons that you don't know what they do. Izuku nodded. How do I turn it back to the mode that takes pictures? Bakugou pointed out the correct button. The moment it switched back to camera mode, Izuku raised the camera and took a picture of Bakugou. Before the other could react, Izuku stood up and told Bakugou to stay where he was. He attempted to find some nice compositions while Bakugou was still processing what had happened, but it wasn't long before the blonde got up and snatched the camera back, growling something about lost privileges. Bakugou flipped through the most recent pictures that Izuku had managed to take, one close-up of his dazed-looking face, followed by a couple decent shots of him sitting on the ledge, and then a series of him getting closer and closer to the camera with his hands slowly obscuring more of the lens. That's Siri's anger in motion, Izuku said, laughing at Bakugou's expression in the photographs. Yeah, well I'll call mine fuckhead at a liquor store. Izuku snickered at that, but pointed at the camera. Go back to that nice one, before you realized what was happening and got mad at me for taking your picture. Bakugou pressed the left arrow button to scroll back to one of the ones where he was sitting on the ledge, looking up at the camera. His expression was uncharacteristically soft, maybe a little confused or taken aback, but lacking the usual harsh lines and set frown. Bakugou actually looked nice when he wasn't being pissy. You should make it your profile picture, too. I haven't changed my profile picture in like 3 years and I'm not about to start now. But these pictures are really cool. The colors reflect off your hair so well, since it's so blonde. My hair's too dark to see much of that, Izuku mused, mindlessly reaching out to touch Bakugou's hair. It was surprisingly soft. Perhaps more surprisingly, Bakugou didn't slap his hand away. You would have made the better model. Too bad it wasn't a self-portrait assignment. Bakugou's hands curled into fists at his sides, eyes trained on Izuku's. Your freckles, he said, suddenly and without context. His voice was quiet enough that Izuku wasn't sure he'd heard him correctly the first time, so he furrowed his brows slightly. Your freckles? You know the things on your face, Space Cadet? Bakugou repeated himself. I thought the lights would look good with your freckles. Izuku's eyes widened at the sudden honesty. He glanced over at the neon lights in the window, then back at Bakugou, a small smile tugging at his lips. Yeah? Do they? No, he lied, uncurling one of his hands and bringing it up to Izuku's face, brushing a thumb over his cheek. He knew Bakugou was tracing over the freckles there. He had them all over, on his cheeks, nose, neck, shoulders. They were fading a bit with winter and a lack of sun exposure, but they never truly went away. They just got more prominent in the summer. He could see the way Bakugou's cheeks flushed in the cold, white plumes of their breath mingling together with how close they were. You're a terrible liar. Bakugou frowned. You don't know the half of it. Izuku layered his hand on top of Bakugou's, his motions slow as though he was afraid of startling the other out of this moment. It wasn't often that the Katsuki Bakugou allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. Izuku's voice sounded breathless when he spoke. What's that supposed to mean? Izuku's question was met with silence from the other. There was nothing but the soft, buzzing hum of the neon lights and the sounds of the city that seemed so far away right now. He tightened his grip on Bakugou's hand, stealing some of his warmth. It was much needed on a night like this. Bakugou remained quiet, but he was staring straight into his eyes with an intensity that made Izuku's heart hammer. In his chest. He had to wonder if Bakugou could hear it in the quiet. Suddenly, the sound of a door sliding open interrupted the peace between them, a harsh reminder that they were still standing in the storefront of some old liquor store. Both their hands dropped from his face as he spun around to look in the direction of the noise. An older man wearing a name tag stormed out of the doorway. He was waving a broom in their direction and yelling something about loitering. Izuku didn't catch it all, too startled and still focused on the sound of his own heart pounding. The only thing he clearly heard were the words, "Call the police if you don't leave." Izuku was thoroughly broken out of his stupor by this. "Oh, sorry, we don't mean any trouble. We'll get going now." He could feel his entire face glowing bright red. Unfortunately, at the same time as he'd stuttered out his apology, Bakugou lifted up his middle finger at the old man and told him to F off. The older man completely ignored Izuku and seemed to only hear and see Bakugou's remark. He angrily tossed the broom in their direction. Bakugou grabbed Izuku's wrist, reaction time as quick as ever, and pulled him along as he took off in a sprint down the street. The old man gave chase briefly, but soon slowed to a stop, panting and hollering at them. Over his shoulder Bakugou yelled back, "Asmai, you old geezer." "Kaken!" Izuku exclaimed, his tone of voice chiding, but he couldn't help but laugh too. Bakugou sent him a surprised look, his anger briefly turning to a triumphant grin as they both slowed to a jog and eventually a walk when they were far enough away. Izuku was grateful that he'd gotten back into running. It would have been quite pathetic if he'd been too out of breath from sprinting just a couple blocks. "Why'd you have to go and talk to him like that?" Izuku asked, once he'd caught his breath. Bakugou finally dropped his hold on his wrist in favor of shoving his hands into his pockets. Bakugou barked out a terse laugh, "'Cause we weren't doing anything wrong. He was just an a-hole who gets off on yelling at people younger than him. Beezy thinks he can talk to me that way? Well, I fucking showed him. Oh yeah, he looked so scared when we ran off. Look, I wasn't about to wait till he actually called the cops. I'm impulsive but I'm not an idiot, Deku. If you want to go back and apologize and get arrested by some bored pig in a uniform, fine, but leave me out of it," Bakugou scoffed. He looked down at himself and checked on the camera still around his neck, inspecting it to make sure it was still working despite their impromptu sprint. He packed it back into the case as they walked down the sidewalk. For a few moments, they didn't talk, and Izuku's smile and residual adrenaline quickly began to drop the further they went. "Hey Kaken." "Yeah, nerd. Where are we?" Bakugou blinked at him, and then looked around. They definitely hadn't come from this direction, or, at least, none of the landmarks looked familiar. The blonde grumbled a curse under his breath and hastily pulled out his phone to bring up a map. It was past 11 p.m. when they got back to their dorm, both of them chilled to the bone, noses red with cold and fingertips starting to go numb. "If it wasn't late," Izuku muttered, pulling off his shoes in the doorway, "I'd make you make me some soup right now because I'm so dim and cold." He regretfully took his jacket off as well. Luckily their dorm was kept nice and toasty in the cold winter months, so warming up wouldn't take too long. "Shut up with your whining," Bakugou rolled his eyes, taking off his own jacket and hanging it up on a nearby hook. Izuku tossed his jacket to Bakugou, who hung his up on the other hook. "My cooking will make it all worth it." "Yeah, probably. Future me will be grateful," Izuku conceded, rubbing his arms through the thick sweater he was still wearing, "but current me is cold and tired and has a class at so I'm gonna crash," Izuku said, grabbing his toothbrush and wandering to the dorm bathroom to brush his teeth. He browsed his phone with his free hand while he did so, noting he had a text from Kirishima, time-stamped from nearly an hour ago. "Kirishima?" Izuku tilted his head at this strange text, but put his phone down in favor of spitting out his toothpaste and washing his face. He passed Bakugou in the hall on his way back to the dorm, the other carrying his own toiletries to get ready for sleep. He changed into pajama pants but kept the sweater on. It was warm and he figured he was going to wash it before giving it back to Bakugou anyways, so whatever. In bed, he turned his phone on again and tried to decipher the strange text. It wasn't until he realized he'd never finished or sent his last text back to Kirishima that it made sense. He quickly finished typing out what he'd meant to say before he'd gotten distracted by the photo shoot. Midoriya, the photography assignment? Kaken said he asked you to model for him originally. We went out to take some pictures tonight. Glad you're okay, smiley face. It was a few minutes before Kirishima replied. Kirishima? Oh, he never asked me to do that? Okay, now it was Izuku's turn to be confused. He rolled over onto his stomach, more alert now, and squinted at the screen in front of him in confusion. If Bakugou hadn't asked Kirishima to work on the photography assignment with him, that meant he hadn't been telling the truth earlier. Why lie about that? Izuku muttered, bringing his hand to his mouth in thought. Bakugou was usually very on top of his assignments, so it was weird that he'd wait to do this so last minute, unless, Izuku reasoned, he'd been too embarrassed that he'd forgotten about the assignment until tonight and hadn't wanted to admit his screw-up to Izuku. That made the most sense, he figured. Midoriya? Oh, I think I misunderstood Kaken earlier, then. Never mind, huh? Have a good night. Kirishima? All good, dude. Izuku locked his phone and set it down on his desk, rolling over to his side to attempt to sleep, finally. He closed his eyes and tugged his blanket up to his chin. A minute later, his phone buzzed. He ignored it the first time, but it went off 3 more times in succession, which prompted Izuku to let out a frustrated noise and reach out for his mobile in the dark and bring it back to his face, the bright light hurting his eyes initially. He'd unlocked it with the intention of turning it on Do Not Disturb mode, but the messages caught his eye. Ashido was texting him? No, Ashido was texting the group chat she'd made to merge Izuku and Bakugou's friend groups a while ago. Izuku tapped on the notification and opened the group. Ashido at Bakugou, I can't believe you asked Midoriya to model for your photography thing when you have me here. Ashido, you know I've always wanted to be a model UJRK. Ashido, good job finally working up the nerve though I guess LMAO. Kirishima, sorry Midoriya, I made the mistake of letting her see my phone. Ashido, you are literally gonna get him killed. Izuku could only watch in horror. Kirishima was right. He was going to die if Bakugou knew he'd been talking to anyone about tonight. Uraraka? What are you guys talking about? Ashido, Bakugou and Midoriya's little date that they apparently went on, tongues sticking out. Where'd you go? Kaminari? Yeah man, where'd our lover boy take you? Oh no, this was getting worse by the second. Damage control needed to be done fast, before he got the little notification at the bottom of the screen to indicate his roommate had read the chat. Izuku knew Ashido and Kaminari were just teasing him, but Bakugou wasn't one to shy away from overreactions. Midoriya? Kaken just had an assignment for his photography class due. Ashido, you have it totally wrong. Tsu, oh. That sounds fun. Send us the pics, Bakugou. I didn't know you liked photography. Kaminari, unless they're tasteful nudes. Keep those to yourself. Ashido, OMG. Uraraka, Kaminari, don't say that. And then, suddenly, that dreaded read by Katsuki Bakugou popped up. For little words, so seemingly innocuous. Moments later, Izuku heard Bakugou yell his name from the bathroom. He didn't sound happy. Quickly, Izuku dived under the covers and typed out his last will and testament to the group chat. Midoriya, when I die, tell my mom I love her. I leave my laptop to Uraraka because I know she needs a new one, and Ida can have Mayad's Fnupo dis. Ashido, RIP.